The Earth once stood on the edge of silence. Glaciers sprawled across continents like vast white fortresses, grinding stone into dust, reshaping valleys, sealing rivers beneath endless ice. Winds swept across barren tundra, carrying shards of frost like knives. The oceans, lower and colder, revealed coastlines no human eyes had ever seen, and across these fragile lands scattered bands of early humans moved in shadows of extinction. This was the last ice age, a world both alien and familiar. The air was sharper, thinner with cold, the nights stretched longer, and survival meant something more primal than we can imagine today. Giant creatures roamed the frozen plains, woolly mammoths, cave lions, and towering ground sloths, while predators, both beast and climate, stalked humankind at every turn. Yet in this crucible of ice and fire, sparks of resilience were struck. Around stone hearths and beneath carved mammoth bones, stories were whispered, tools were sharpened, and the fragile thread of humanity held fast against unimaginable odds. Science now unravels this tale, through the bones buried in permafrost, the pollen trapped in ancient lake beds, and the scars carved deep in bedrock by glaciers. What emerges is not only a chronicle of survival, but a reminder of how close humanity came to vanishing beneath the weight of ice. This is not just history, it is a mirror, reflecting what it means to endure when the world itself seems intent on erasing us. Welcome to Arcane Skies. If you wish to journey deeper into humanity's forgotten winters, remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts about where and when you're watching. The story begins here. The world of the last ice age did not begin abruptly, but like the slow drawing of a curtain, darkness and cold crept forward across centuries. Scientists call it the late Pleistocene, a span between roughly 110,000 and 12,000 years ago, when sheets of ice advanced and retreated in colossal cycles. Imagine a stage larger than continents, where glaciers towered higher than skyscrapers and spread for hundreds of miles, pressing the earth down beneath their weight. They were not still monoliths, but moving rivers of frozen stone, reshaping the world with each grinding step. Mountains were carved sharper, valleys deepened, and entire forests were swallowed by the unrelenting freeze. In this stark and unforgiving world, small groups of humans fought not only against predators, but against time itself, carrying within their fragile bodies the promise of all future generations. When the ice reached its maximum, nearly a third of the planet's landmass was covered. North America bore two massive shields of ice, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, walls of frozen water that merged over what is now Canada, their weight so immense that the land beneath is still rebounding upward today. Europe was crushed under another white expanse stretching from the British Isles to Siberia. To the south of these glacial fortresses stretched tundra, frozen plains where permafrost locked the soil like concrete, where only moss, lichen and scrubby grass dared to grow. For the creatures that roamed this landscape, adaptation was not optional. It was life's only law. Mammoths grew thick coats of insulating fur, their tusks curling like ivory scythes through the snow. Saber-toothed cats prowled the edges of herds, their fangs glinting in the low sun. Even birds evolved to find niches in this strange, frigid world, some scavenging carcasses left behind by larger predators, others migrating across newly revealed land bridges that connected continents. Yet while animals had the gift of instinct and physical adaptation, humanity had only wit, cooperation, and fire. The archaeological record shows that humans were not just passive wanderers, but problem solvers in the face of near impossibility. They crafted shelters from bones and hides, shaping mammoth rib cages into frames and stretching skins taut against the wind. Flint was napped into blades sharp enough to slice through frozen muscle, tools small in form but monumental in consequence. Fire itself was more than heat. It was light in endless winter, a fragile sun carried in embers from one encampment to the next. But survival was not merely about battling cold, it was about navigating scarcity. With so much of the planet's water locked in ice, sea levels plummeted by nearly 400 feet, exposing new lands but reducing the fertility of oceans. Coastal ecosystems shrank, fish stocks collapsed in some areas, and inland rivers froze solid for months at a time. Herds of grazing animals migrated across enormous distances, forcing human bands to follow with relentless persistence. The chase was not always successful, and hunger gnawed at the edges of every story told in caves and every set of tracks pressed into snow. Still, there is evidence that creativity flourished under these constraints. In Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, deep inside caves hidden from the brutal winds, humans painted animals with astonishing realism. Bison, horses, rhinoceroses, lions. These were not idle sketches, but symbols of reverence, of hope, perhaps even of rituals meant to draw luck from the creatures they depended on. The very act of creating art in a time when starvation was a constant threat suggests that survival is not only about food and shelter, it is about meaning, about holding on to identity when the world conspires to strip it away. In the darkest winters, imagination itself became a survival tool. This fragile persistence was tested again and again by shifts in climate. Ice ages are not steady states. They pulse with advances and retreats. A single change in ocean currents, a tilt in Earth's orbit, or a pulse of volcanic activity could tip the balance. Scientists studying ice cores, cylinders drilled deep into Greenland and Antarctic glaciers, read these ancient climate stories in layers of compacted snow, each line a whisper of atmosphere from tens of thousands of years ago. Within them are sudden spikes of warmth, and equally brutal plunges back into cold, some occurring within a single human lifetime. For those living through such abrupt shifts, the world could transform in ways that seemed almost supernatural, rivers thawing and flooding new valleys, then freezing solid again, forests creeping northward only to die back under advancing ice. And yet, against these colossal forces, humanity endured. Part of the secret lay in movement. Where animals migrated instinctively, humans planned, tracked, and adapted routes. The Bering Land Bridge, exposed by low sea levels, allowed humans to cross from Asia into the Americas, carrying with them not only tools but myths and languages that would seed entire continents. Across Eurasia, groups expanded into open plains when prey was abundant, then retreated into more sheltered valleys when the winds grew unbearable. Survival was a dance guided by the rhythm of the ice, each step both desperate and ingenious. Still, the Ice Age carried with it shadows darker than mere cold. The giants of the animal kingdom, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats and more, were living testaments to an ancient order of life. Many of them would not survive the shifting climate or the relentless pressure of human hunting. To imagine their final days is to picture a silent tundra where once thundering herds no longer pass, a lonely horizon where predators wait in vain. These extinctions would forever alter the balance of ecosystems, forcing humans to adapt again, this time not just to the cold but to the absence of animals that had sustained them for generations. In the silence that followed each collapse, there was always the sound of wind over ice, a reminder of the vast forces at work. For early humans, the question was not why the world changed, but how to endure it long enough to see another sunrise. And while their understanding of the cosmos was rooted in myth and symbol, their survival was written in practical genius, in the hearth fires they guarded, in the paths they traced across shifting landscapes, in the hands that carved bone and stone into tools that still speak across millennia. But survival in the Ice Age was not merely a test of physical resilience, it was a test of spirit. To endure hunger, to confront predators, to cross frozen rivers in pursuit of vanishing herds, All required not just strength, but belief. Belief that tomorrow might bring warmth, that the hunt would succeed, that the tribe's children would see spring. In this way, the last ice age was both a crucible of suffering and a forge of humanity itself, shaping not only bodies but minds, planting the seeds of cooperation, of story, of imagination. And as the winds howled across the frozen plains, carrying with them both the promise of death and the possibility of survival, humanity's fate remained uncertain, balanced as precariously as a flame in the open tundra. The question lingered in every firelit cave and along every frozen trail. Could a fragile species truly withstand the weight of so much ice, or would the world bury them as it had buried countless others before? Beyond the horizon, in shadows yet unseen, the answer awaited in landscapes even more hostile, where survival would demand more than fire and stone. It would demand transformation. The second act of the Ice Age world was written not only in ice, but in the delicate balance of ecosystems struggling to hold together beneath the crushing cold. Life was a constant improvisation. Each species that managed to persist did so with strategies honed over countless generations, and yet even the most resilient creatures teetered on the edge. Vast herds of mammoths and bison trudged across the permafrost, their migrations like rivers of flesh moving endlessly in search of grass. These herds were more than just animals. They were the beating heart of the steppe tundra, feeding predators, nourishing scavengers, and shaping the land itself with their constant movement. Where they grazed, new plants could grow. Where they perished, nutrients returned to the soil, sustaining cycles of life that refused to break even in the harshest of winters. Alongside these giants lived smaller creatures equally vital to the web of survival. Arctic hares darted across snowfields, their white coats rendering them nearly invisible until the moment they leapt. Lemmings burrowed through frozen ground, their populations rising and falling in rhythms that baffled predators and scientists alike. Wolves followed in the shadows, learning to hunt not as solitary killers but as coordinated packs, a behaviour that would later weave their destinies with humans. In this theatre of survival, nothing was wasted, and every adaptation was a thread in the fragile fabric of existence. But the balance was fragile. The cold sculpted not only bodies but also behaviours, pressing every creature toward efficiency. To burn too many calories on a failed hunt could mean starvation. To misjudge the timing of migration could mean entire herds lost to storms. For humans, every decision carried a weight heavier than any stone tool. Should they risk crossing an ice-choked river in pursuit of prey? Should they burn the last of their wood for warmth, or save it for cooking meat that might never arrive? These questions defined existence in ways as real as the mammoths themselves. The archaeological record reveals fragments of these choices. In sites scattered across Eurasia, layers of ash mark ancient hearths, some reused again and again across centuries, proof that humans return to the same sheltering cliffs or caves each season. Charred bones tell of meals shared, of marrow cracked open to extract every last calorie. Even the footprints pressed into cave floors remain, small outlines of children running alongside adults, a ghostly testimony to the continuity of life. Each trace suggests not merely survival, but persistence, the stubborn refusal to vanish into the silence of ice. Yet survival was never solitary. The Ice Age demanded cooperation on scales larger than the individual families. Hunting a mammoth required coordination, planning, and trust. Spears had to be hurled in unison, fires sometimes used to drive herds into traps, and the carcass had to be butchered quickly before predators arrived. Such tasks were impossible for a lone hunter. They were only achieved through communities bound together by shared risk and shared reward. It was in these crucibles of cooperation that the seeds of human society were forged, long before cities or kingdoms existed. To share food was to share survival itself. Still, life was precarious. The Ice Age was not a single unbroken freeze, but a rhythm of warming and cooling pulses, some lasting centuries, others mere decades. Scientists studying Greenland's ice cores have identified events known as Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, abrupt shifts in temperature that could raise or lower average conditions by more than 10 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime. Imagine being born into a world of snowfields and frozen rivers, only to watch in old age as forests reclaim the plains, and then as they retreated once more under advancing ice. For human groups, these changes were both opportunity and threat. Warming opened new lands for plants and animals, but it also melted glaciers that sent catastrophic floods roaring across valleys. Cooling drove prey southward, but it also concentrated herds into smaller ranges, making them easier and more dangerous to hunt. As humans adapted, so too did their minds expand to grasp the mysteries of the changing earth. The carvings and paintings left behind in caves were not only depictions of animals, they were attempts to impose meaning on a chaotic world. A bison painted in ochre, glowing in torchlight against stone, may have been more than art. It could have been prayer, memory, or prophecy. Archaeologists have found bone flutes, some over 35,000 years old, their notes still playable today. To create music in the midst of scarcity is to declare that existence is more than endurance. It is to insist on beauty in the shadow of extinction. But beauty did not shield them from hardship. Disease, injury, and cold took a heavy toll. A broken leg on the tundra often meant death unless carried by others, yet skeletons from this period show healed fractures, suggesting that communities cared for their wounded. Teeth reveal enamel defects from malnutrition, scars of hunger etched into the very bodies that walk through the Ice Age. Life expectancy was short, yet within those years bonds were strong enough to sustain not only the living but also the memory of the dead. Graves filled with ornaments of ivory, shells and ochre show reverence for those who had passed, a recognition that survival was not only physical but also spiritual. In the silence between storms when the wind dropped and stars pierced the black sky, these early humans must have looked upward and wondered if the heavens held answers. They did not know of orbital cycles or solar activity, but they could feel the rhythm of the planet. Myths were born in these moments, stories to explain why the ice advanced, why the sun sometimes seemed weaker, why animals vanished into the whiteness and did not return. These stories, carried from mouth to mouth, were as vital as flint knives or fur cloaks. They bound communities with shared memory, with explanations that gave shape to uncertainty. And so the Ice Age world was not merely an arena of survival, but a crucible of meaning. Each firelit cave, each painted wall, each buried body spoke to a deeper truth, that humanity endured not only because of its tools, but because of its capacity to imagine. When prey fled and storms raged, imagination offered hope. When hunger gnawed and cold cut to the bone, imagination offered purpose. It was this fragile thread, woven from cooperation, memory and belief, that carried humanity across centuries of cold. Yet as powerful as these threads were, they were constantly tested by forces larger than human comprehension. The Earth itself was in flux, its axis tilting, its orbit stretching, its oceans surging. These forces would continue to remake the world, sometimes gently, sometimes with catastrophic suddenness, and in each shift humanity would face a new question. How far could adaptation stretch before it broke? Beyond the ice-cloaked horizon, the next transformation waited, one that would not merely test survival, but demand migrations across entire continents, reshaping the destiny of humankind forever. The march of survival during the last Ice Age was never linear. It pulsed like breath, advance, retreat, collapse, renewal. The environment was alive with extremes, and each shift brought new trials that reshaped both landscapes and the fragile beings who walked them. When glaciers pressed forward, they ground mountains into gravel and erased rivers from the map. When they receded, valleys bloomed with grasses, and animals surged across the open plains in waves of movement that humans learned to follow like tides. To exist in this shifting world was to read the earth as one might read a pulse, attuned to every tremor in the soil and every change in the wind. It is within this restless rhythm that humanity's ingenuity grew sharper. The great megafauna, those colossal beasts that once defined the Ice Age, were both lifeline and threat. A mammoth could feed an entire band of humans for weeks, its hide turned into shelter, its bones carved into tools. But hunting one was an act bordering on madness, a wrong step, a charge from tusks the size of trees, and death would come swiftly. To bring down such giants required courage, coordination, and tools that were becoming ever more sophisticated. Archaeologists have uncovered spear points crafted from flint, shaped with such precision that they split hide and muscle with terrifying efficiency. These weapons, combined with fire and strategy, allowed groups to face creatures that once seemed invincible. Yet the mammoth steppe, that sprawling biome of grassland stretching from Spain to Alaska, was more than a hunting ground. It was a living stage where countless dramas unfolded. Woolly rhinoceroses ploughed through snow to reach frozen grasses, their massive horns cutting furrows in the ice. Musk oxen huddled against storms, their thick coats forming a living fortress. Cave lions stalked silently, their paws padded for stealth, their golden eyes glinting even in weak winter light. These predators were not only competitors but also teachers. By observing them, humans learned patience, stealth, and the art of reading prey. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, and survival depended on respecting that balance. Still, the environment's cruelty pushed humans toward something beyond observation. They began to shape their surroundings in ways that marked the dawn of deep control. Fire, once only a gift stolen from lightning or volcanic eruptions, became a deliberate tool. Groups set controlled burns to drive animals toward traps, or to clear frozen brush so new shoots could lure grazing herds. In this act, they transformed from mere participants in nature to active shapers of it, laying the earliest foundation for humanity's long, complex relationship with the environment. But even as tools and strategies advanced, there were limits. Winter stretched with merciless length, and hunger was never far. Archaeological sites reveal gnawed bones that bear marks not only of hunting but of desperation. Evidence suggests that in some winters, when prey was scarce and famine closed in, humans may have turned to scavenging predator kills, or even to cannibalism. These acts were not born of cruelty but of necessity, reminders that survival often came at the edge of morality. Despite these struggles, culture deepened. Music, art and ritual flourished even when resources dwindled. The bone flutes, ivory carvings and cave paintings were not luxuries, they were anchors against despair. They offered order to chaos, allowing humans to frame their existence in symbols larger than themselves. A painting of a bison charging across stone was not just an image of food. It was an affirmation that life persisted, that the hunt would come again, that meaning existed in the relentless churn of seasons. One of the most extraordinary aspects of this period lies in humanity's spread across the globe. The falling seas had revealed new pathways, most notably the land bridge known as Beringia, which connected Siberia to Alaska. This vast corridor of tundra and steppe became a gateway to the Americas. Small groups of humans crossed, following herds of caribou and bison, unaware that they were stepping into lands no humans had ever seen. Their presence would eventually change entire ecosystems, but at the time, each crossing was a gamble with survival. Once across, retreat was nearly impossible, and the only path forward was adaptation. The archaeological evidence from these early migrations tells of extraordinary resilience. Stone tools buried deep in Alaskan soil, bones charred in ancient hearths, and traces of campsites suggest that even in the face of biting winds and endless night, humanity found ways to endure. They carried not only tools but knowledge. How to trap small game, how to store food in frozen ground, how to read the stars when the earth beneath their feet shifted with glaciers. Each journey was not just physical, but generational. Knowledge passed from elders to children like fire passed from ember to ember. Yet the Ice Age was not only a test of bodies and tools, it was a relentless trial of faith. To awaken each day in a world where storms could erase entire landscapes overnight required belief in something larger than survival itself. Burials from this time tell us much about that unseen dimension. Graves lined with red ochre, beads carved from bone, and animal remains placed alongside the dead suggest rituals that linked life to death, community to eternity. To honour the dead in such ways, when every resource was precious, reveals the profound weight of meaning in their lives. Death was not the end. It was woven into the story of survival, a reminder that existence carried on through memory, ritual and bloodline. But the weight of ice was merciless, and the question remained, how long could this precarious balance last? Extinction loomed in more ways than one. The great beasts that dominated the mammoth steppe were beginning to falter. Climate shifts reduced the grasses they relied on, and the pressure of human hunting grew heavier with each passing generation. Slowly, inexorably, the giants that had once seemed eternal began to vanish. Each loss rippled through the ecosystem, forcing predators to starve, forcing humans to adapt to smaller prey. The age of giants was waning, and with it came new uncertainties. The world itself was restless, never still. The tilt of the earth, the pull of the sun, the flow of ocean currents, all conspired to create cycles beyond human control. Volcanic eruptions darkened skies, their ash layers still preserved in ice cores today. Meteors may have blazed across the atmosphere, their fiery descent leaving whispers of catastrophe in the soil. For humans living through these upheavals, the causes were unknowable, but the consequences were immediate and brutal. Survival was not a question of mastery, but of adaptation to forces far beyond comprehension. And still, they endured. Each campfire lit against the wind, each carving etched into ivory, each burial adorned with ochre was an act of defiance, a refusal to yield to the cold silence. Humanity persisted not because it was the strongest, but because it was the most adaptive, capable of weaving meaning into suffering and strategy into chaos. Yet the Ice Age was not finished testing them. Ahead lay landscapes even more unforgiving. Barren interiors of continents, deserts of ice where prey vanished and storms raged with unrelenting fury. To cross these spaces, humanity would need more than fire and stone. They would need vision, memory, and the strength to reimagine survival itself. As the millennia unfolded beneath the grip of the last Ice Age, the Earth became a theatre of contrasts. Blistering winds and frozen plains in the north, and yet farther south, lands that still pulsed with life in lush valleys and open savannas. This contrast created migration corridors, fragile arteries through which humanity and animals alike could move, survive, and adapt. Each step southward was a gamble. Warmer climates offered relief, but they also carried new dangers, new predators, and rival human groups already struggling to hold on to their own fragile niches. The Ice Age was not only a struggle against nature, but a constant tension between peoples, animals, and shifting frontiers. In Africa, where Homo sapiens first emerged, the effects of the Ice Age were felt in alternating waves of drought and abundance. Rainfall shifted as global climates wavered, turning grasslands into deserts and deserts into grasslands. Lakes that once sprawled for miles shrank into cracked basins, and then, centuries later, swelled again with sudden rains. This pattern, driven by oscillations in monsoons and the pull of Earth's orbit, forced humans into cycles of dispersal and return. Archaeological evidence from East Africa shows that groups moved along river valleys when water flowed, leaving behind stone tools and hearths that reveal a rhythm of migration deeply tied to climate. When rains failed, survival hinged on innovation, storing water in skins, hunting smaller game, or foraging for roots that lay hidden beneath the parched soil. Meanwhile, in Eurasia, glacial walls locked the north in silence, but the steppes that stretched across modern-day Ukraine, Kazakhstan and Mongolia became lifelines. These grasslands, though harsh, were capable of supporting herds of bison, wild horses and saiga antelope. For humans, the steppes were both home and highway, routes of movement that stretched for thousands of miles. Bands of people carried not only tools but also ideas, stories and symbolic objects. Beads carved from shells, figurines of animals and human forms etched patterns that seemed to whisper of an emerging symbolic language. These artifacts hinted an invisible thread binding communities across great distances, suggesting that even in the isolation of the Ice Age, there was a shared human story unfolding. Among the most enigmatic traces of this period are the so-called Venus figurines, small carvings of women, their features exaggerated, discovered across Europe and Siberia. Crafted from stone, ivory and clay, these figures may have represented fertility, survival, or a spiritual connection to the cycles of life and death. To shape such figures in times of scarcity shows that the human mind was reaching beyond immediate survival into realms of belief and meaning. The Ice Age was not merely endured, it was interpreted, and in that interpretation, humanity created identity. But identity did not shield them from hunger. Hunting in this era was a razor's edge, balancing between abundance and disaster. When herds were plentiful, entire communities thrived, storing meat in frozen ground, feasting, and creating time for rituals and art. When herds shifted their routes, as they often did in response to storms, drought, or subtle climate swings, famine returned with merciless speed. The pursuit of prey required reading landscapes like maps, sensing where grass might sprout beneath snow, where rivers might unfreeze earliest in spring. Over time, humans honed this ability into instinct, a skill so finely tuned it bordered on the spiritual. Survival was written into the very act of walking, of noticing the tilt of the wind, the scent of thawing earth, the tracks pressed into frost by hooves heading south. While animals gave food and shelter, plants were a quieter but vital partner. Archaeological remains show that humans gathered seeds, berries and roots, supplementing their diet with what little the tundra and steppe could offer. Charred seeds discovered in hearths reveal experimentation, the beginnings of knowledge that plants could be stored, processed and perhaps even nurtured. Though agriculture lay far in the future, its earliest whispers may have begun in these lean times when the need to stretch every resource sparked new ways of thinking about the land. The Ice Age was also a time of movement outward, a great dispersal across continents. Groups from Africa expanded into the Middle East, then farther into Asia and Europe, while others crossed into the islands of Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. Each migration was both a risk and a revolution. To enter new lands meant confronting unknown animals, climates and diseases. It meant learning new ways to hunt, new ways to build shelter, new ways to survive. Yet it also meant expansion of diversity, of tools, of language, of ideas. Every step widened the story of humanity, pushing it into corners of the world once thought unreachable. Some of these migrations were forced, driven by the crushing advance of ice or the collapse of ecosystems. Others may have been driven by curiosity, by the simple human urge to see what lay beyond the horizon. The two impulses, survival and wonder, are often difficult to separate. What is clear is that each migration reshaped both humanity and the environments they entered. The megafauna of Australia, for instance, faced new predators in humans who hunted with skill and fire The balance that had existed for millions of years began to shift, and the fate of countless species would be rewritten. Still, not all was conquest. There is growing evidence that humans formed complex relationships with the landscapes they entered. In some regions, fire was used not just for hunting, but for shaping ecosystems, clearing forests to encourage the growth of grasses that would attract grazing animals. In others, humans developed seasonal patterns of movement that aligned with migrations of animals and cycles of plants, ensuring sustainability across generations. This delicate dance between use and renewal shows that the Ice Age was not only a crucible of survival, but also a laboratory of ecological awareness. At the same time, danger lurked in forms unseen. Disease spread easily among small groups huddled together in shelters. Injuries from hunts or accidents could cripple hunters, threatening entire communities. To endure these trials required care, and the archaeological record reveals evidence of it. Skeletons of individuals who lived long after injuries that would have killed them without support. This suggests compassion, a trait as vital as fire or flint. In the cold shadow of glaciers, empathy became a survival tool, binding groups with bonds stronger than hunger or fear. Night after night, under skies strewn with stars unpolluted by any modern light, humans must have lifted their gaze upward. The constellations above, shifting with the seasons, would have served as maps, calendars, and sources of myth. In those brilliant skies, patterns could be seen, perhaps stories of animals, hunters, or spirits guiding them through the long dark. The Ice Age was written not only in earth and stone, but also in the heavens, where the rhythms of the cosmos mirrored the rhythms of survival on the ground, and yet beneath the stars and within the frozen soil, another story was unfolding, one far older and deeper than any painting or carving. In the bones of mammoths, in the pollen locked in permafrost, in the DNA passed from parent to child, the blueprint of survival was being inscribed. Humanity was not simply enduring the Ice Age, it was being transformed by it in ways that would echo long after the glaciers melted. As the winds howled across the tundra and rivers carved their paths through ice, a question hovered unspoken in every campfire circle. How far could this fragile species journey before the world itself shifted again? The answer lay not only in the lands they crossed, but in the hidden forces stirring within the earth, forces that would one day unleash storms greater than any they had yet faced. The deep freeze of the last Ice Age was not static, but a shifting mosaic of climates and catastrophes that rippled across continents. One of the most haunting features of this era was the unpredictability of the environment, for the ice did not simply advance in steady lines like armies on a map. It lunged forward, stalled, and retreated with sudden violence, creating floods, storms, and collapses that must have seemed like the wrath of unseen gods. For those living in the grip of such changes, the world could shift overnight, transforming valleys into lakes, plains into swamps, and rivers into raging torrents that swept away entire herds and the fragile shelters of humans who depended on them. Evidence for these sudden upheavals lies etched in stone and buried in layers of silt. Geologists studying the scablands of North America have uncovered vast channels carved by water, moving with apocalyptic force. These were the Missoula floods, unleashed when glacial dams holding back colossal lakes burst, sending walls of water racing across the land at speeds rivaling modern storms. Entire landscapes were reshaped in days, leaving behind boulder-strewn valleys and wave marks etched into cliffs. For the humans who may have witnessed such floods, survival meant fleeing with little more than fire and memory, abandoning campsites and sacred places to forces too immense to comprehend. In Eurasia, similar events unfolded. As ice sheets melted and shifted, rivers swelled beyond their banks, and new lakes spread across plains that had been hunting grounds only generations before. Imagine the disorientation of seeing the land of ancestors vanish beneath rising waters, of watching familiar trails submerged, of knowing that prey would never again follow the same paths. These upheavals not only tested resilience but also fractured memory. for oral traditions could only stretch so far when landscapes themselves were erased. But nature's violence was not only in water. Volcanoes erupted with furious force, their ash darkening skies and choking lungs. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba super-eruption in what is now Indonesia may have been one of the most catastrophic events humans ever faced. The eruption hurled vast amounts of ash into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight and lowering global temperatures. Some scientists argue that this volcanic winter pushed humanity to the brink of extinction, reducing populations to scattered bands numbering perhaps only a few thousand. Though debate continues over the exact severity, the evidence in ice cores and ocean sediments tells of cooling that gripped the planet for centuries. For humans already battling ice and hunger, the added veil of volcanic ash would have been devastating. Yet even amid collapse, life found ways to endure. Plants adapted by retreating into sheltered valleys, seeds preserved in frozen soils until the sun returned. Animals shifted their ranges, migrating farther in search of food, while predators adjusted their hunting strategies to pursue new prey. And humans, fragile but resourceful, learned to turn disaster into adaptation. Ash layers may have poisoned some lands, but they also enriched soils over time, creating fertile grounds once climates stabilized. Such cycles of destruction and renewal imprinted themselves on human memory, becoming the foundations of myths about fire from the sky, floods that swallowed the earth, and darkness that devoured the sun. In these times of upheaval, mobility became salvation. Groups that could move quickly and adapt routes survived, while those who lingered too long in collapsing landscapes risked annihilation. This restlessness, this willingness to abandon the familiar, became a defining trait of humanity during the Ice Age. To move was to live, even if it meant crossing frozen rivers at night, dragging children and possessions across treacherous ice, or walking into lands where no tracks marked the snow. Migration was no longer just an option, but a way of life, encoded into muscle and memory. And as they moved, humans encountered other hominins, cousins in the evolutionary tree who had adapted differently to the Ice Age. In Europe and Western Asia lived the Neanderthal, stocky, powerful hunters who had thrived in cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bones tell of strength, their tools of skill, their burials of care for the dead. In Asia, other groups lingered. The Denisovans, known today only through fragments of bone and genetic traces, yet evidence of their existence lingers in the DNA of modern humans in Asia and Oceania. These encounters were not always violent. They brought exchange, interbreeding, and a mingling of ideas and technologies. The DNA carried in every human alive today bears witness to these ancient meetings, proof that survival was never a solitary path but a braided river of lineages. What drove Homo sapiens to eventually outlast these cousins is a question still debated. Some point to differences in social networks, arguing that larger, more connected groups of sapiens shared resources more effectively. Others suggest that flexibility in diet and tools gave them an edge. Perhaps it was not superiority in any single trait, but the combination of adaptability, imagination, and cooperation that allowed sapiens to survive where others did not. Whatever the cause, the Ice Age became a filter, through which only certain lineages could pass, their survival etched into our very blood. Meanwhile, the great beasts of the Ice Age continued to walk the land, though their fates were tied to the same shifting climates. Mastodons in North America browsed through forests that vanished as ice advanced. Giant ground sloths roamed South America, stripping leaves with claws like scythes. In Australia, marsupial giants such as Diprotodon grazed until human arrival tipped the balance. These creatures were more than prey or predators. They were architects of ecosystems, shaping vegetation, dispersing seeds, and maintaining balance. Their eventual decline was not only a loss of food, but a collapse of entire ecological systems, leaving gaps that would never fully close. For humans, every extinction was both a tragedy and a test. To lose a species meant to lose a source of meat, hide, or bone, forcing new strategies to emerge. Smaller game became more important, fishing techniques advanced, and the gathering of plants took on new urgency. The Ice Age was a constant negotiation with scarcity, and each adaptation deepened the human toolkit. By necessity, they became generalists, capable of surviving in deserts, forests, coasts, and tundras alike. This breadth of skill would prove crucial when the world began to thaw and new opportunities opened. Yet for all their adaptability, the emotional burden of these times must have been immense. To live in a world where storms could erase familiar landscapes, where kin could vanish on hunts never to return, where skies could darken without warning, was to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. And so humans turned to meaning, weaving narratives that gave structure to chaos, stories of floods, of fire, of beasts that once roamed, carried the memory of catastrophe across generations. These myths, though shaped by imagination, preserved truths about survival strategies, about the dangers of particular lands, about the need for cooperation in the face of overwhelming odds. The last Ice Age was more than an environmental crisis. It was the crucible in which humanity was tested again and again. Each volcanic eruption, each flood, each collapse of prey populations demanded not just endurance, but transformation. The survivors were those who could learn, who could carry memory across fire and frost, who could pass on not only tools but also wisdom. And yet, just beyond the horizon, even greater challenges waited. The ice would not remain forever. It would crack, retreat, and unleash floods of unimaginable scale, rewriting coastlines and reshaping human destiny. The question was no longer only how to endure the cold, but how to survive a world in motion, where the very boundaries of land and sea shifted like sand beneath the feet. The world during the height of the last Ice Age was a restless and unpredictable canvas. Though glaciers towered across much of the northern hemisphere, enclosing entire regions in silence, other parts of the Earth pulsed with transformation. As ice accumulated, sea levels fell, carving coastlines far beyond the reach of modern tides. Where waves once surged, plains now stretched into the horizon, exposing lands no human had seen before. These were temporary worlds, bridges of earth-linking continents, corridors of migration and survival that would one day vanish beneath the returning seas. One of the most remarkable of these lands was Beringia, the vast expanse that once connected Siberia and Alaska. It was not merely a narrow bridge but a sprawling steppe tundra, thousands of miles wide, teeming with life. Herds of mammoth and bison roamed across its grasses, followed by wolves, lions, and the sharp-eyed hunters who depended on them. Archaeologists believe that humans crossed this landscape in waves, some lingering in its valleys for generations, others pressing onward into the unknown reaches of the Americas. The significance of Beringia cannot be overstated. It was the threshold through which humanity entered an entire new hemisphere. The crossing itself must have been harrowing. Winters were brutal, summers brief, and filled with swarms of insects, and the movement of herds could change in a single season. Yet humans endured, leaving faint traces in stone blades and hearth remains buried beneath layers of permafrost. Genetic evidence today confirms what these artifacts whisper. Every indigenous people of the Americas carries within them the legacy of those crossings, a thread of ancestry spun across frozen tundra and bound to the memory of the ice. But Beringia was only one of many shifting landscapes. Across Europe, valleys carved by glaciers revealed fertile plains when the ice retreated, only to be swallowed again when it advanced. In the Middle East, the region we now call the Levant became a refuge, a rare pocket of relative warmth and diversity where humans and Neanderthals lived side by side. Fossil remains from caves in Israel and Syria reveal overlapping timelines of occupation, suggesting moments of coexistence, exchange, and perhaps conflict. Here, in these narrow refuges, human destiny may have hinged on fragile encounters, alliances formed in hardship, rivalries born in hunger, and the mingling of lineages that still echo in our DNA. Meanwhile, in Africa, the cradle of humanity, climates oscillated between extremes. Some regions grew wetter, drawing humans toward rivers and lakes that pulsed with fish and game. Others withered under drought, driving migrations that carried people outward once again. Archaeological layers from southern Africa preserve evidence of shells gathered from coasts, pigments ground for body decoration, and finely crafted microlithic tools, small stone blades hafted into wood or bone, creating versatile hunting weapons. These innovations reveal not just adaptation to scarcity, but foresight, the ability to shape tools for multiple uses, anticipating the unpredictability of survival. This growing versatility was a hallmark of Homo sapiens. Unlike other hominins, who often specialized in narrow niches, sapiens developed strategies broad enough to cross deserts, climb mountains, and survive in tundra. This flexibility was not only biological but cultural. Knowledge was shared and refined, passed from one generation to the next through stories, demonstrations, and perhaps even early symbolic language. To carve a tool from flint was not merely to shape stone, it was to inherit a lineage of skill perfected over centuries, and to add one's own refinement for the future. In caves, across France and Spain, the explosion of symbolic expression reveals how imagination became intertwined with survival. The paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux are not simple illustrations of animals, but layered visions, filled with movement, detail, and perhaps ritual power. Some images overlap, suggesting generations returning to the same walls, adding new strokes of meaning to the living canvas. By torchlight, these figures seem to move, shadows flickering across walls as if the animals themselves breathed again. Such art may have been more than memory. It may have been invocation, a way of binding human fate to the cycles of the herds and the seasons. Beyond art, music too took root. Bone flutes carved with precise holes played notes still recognizable today. The fact that humans in the Ice Age made instruments suggests that survival was not only about the body but also the spirit. Music created cohesion, rhythm for rituals, and a sense of belonging that no storm could extinguish. It is possible to imagine hunters returning weary from the tundra, gathering by the fire and hearing notes rise into the cold night air, reminders that life, even in its fragility, could carry beauty. But beauty existed alongside peril. As groups expanded, they encountered not only the forces of nature but also one another. The archaeological record hints at conflicts, shattered bones with marks of weapons, fortifications built from wood and stone. When resources grew scarce, competition turned violent, and survival meant defending territory as fiercely as hunting prey. Yet violence was not the only outcome. Exchange also occurred. Shell beads travelled far inland from coasts. Obsidian from distant volcanic regions appears in campsites hundreds of miles away. These exchanges speak to networks that stretched across vast territories, webs of interaction that wove humanity together even in an age of isolation. The Ice Age world was thus one of contradictions: starvation and feasting, isolation and exchange, destruction and creation. Every advance of ice threatened collapse, and yet every retreat opened new doors. Humans walk these thresholds, constantly adapting, carrying fire, tools, and stories into lands where no human footprints had ever been before. Each migration was a gamble, but each gamble expanded the boundaries of survival. Perhaps the greatest gamble of all was trust. Trust in one another, in the bonds that held families and groups together. Evidence of care for the injured and the elderly suggests that humans invested in lives even when immediate survival seemed more practical. This investment, though costly, created resilience. A group that protected its vulnerable could preserve knowledge, maintain cohesion, and endure where others might fracture. Compassion, paradoxically, became an evolutionary advantage, a strength that rivaled spears and fire. Yet compassion did not erase uncertainty. The earth was restless, and its rhythms did not bend to human will. In ice cores drilled deep in Greenland, scientists today find records of sudden temperature swings, abrupt warmings of up to 10 degrees Celsius within mere decades, followed by plunges back into cold. For the humans who lived through these shifts, the world must have seemed unstable, as if the ground itself could not be trusted. Rivers once dependable froze solid, grasslands collapsed into marsh, prey vanished overnight. To endure required not only adaptation but anticipation, the ability to plan for futures that were unknowable. It is here that imagination once again proved indispensable. To imagine what might happen was to prepare for it, even if imperfectly. To carve tools with multiple uses, to paint animals on cave walls, to tell stories around fires, all were acts of extending survival beyond the immediate present into a horizon yet to come. This ability to think ahead, to plan, to hope, became the fragile shield that allowed humanity to walk through ice and fire alike. But the question loomed like the shadow of a glacier. How long could these strategies hold? Could fire, stone, and story protect against forces that seemed to rewrite the earth itself? Ahead lay challenges even more profound. Waves of extinction that would strip the land of its giants, floods that would carve new seas, and the slow but inexorable retreat of the ice that had shaped every life for generations. The story of survival was far from finished. It was only deepening, moving toward trials that would test not only the endurance of the body but the very identity of humanity itself. The Ice Age was a paradox of abundance and scarcity, a world where vast herds of animals could thunder across plains one year and vanish the next, where a valley might bloom with grasses after a brief warming, only to be buried beneath snow when the cold returned. For humans, this unstable rhythm was both gift and curse. When prey was plentiful, survival seemed possible, even generous, allowing feasts, ornament-making, and long nights of storytelling. But when migration shifted or storm struck at the wrong time, the same landscape could turn into a silent expanse of hunger, leaving entire bands to wonder if tomorrow would arrive with food or with emptiness. In this fragile equation, the megafauna, the giants of the Ice Age, played a central role. Mammoths, mastodons, giant bison, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, they were the titans that defined the age. To hunt them was perilous, but their sheer size offered rewards unmatched by smaller prey. A single mammoth provided enough meat to feed dozens of people, its hide transformed into shelter, its bones into tools. But each hunt was a gamble of lives. Evidence of spear points lodged deep within mammoth bones reveals the dangerous intimacy of these confrontations. Hunters had to move as one, striking in unison, risking death beneath tusks and trampling feet. To succeed was triumph. To fail could mean disaster. The fate of these giants, however, was not only in human hands. Climate was changing, reshaping the ecosystems that sustained them. Grasses withered in some regions, replaced by forests unsuited to grazing herds. Cold snaps fragmented habitats, isolating populations until they dwindled. The great beast had endured countless cycles before, but this time was different. Pressed between a changing world and a clever predator, unlike any they had faced before, their decline began. Fossils reveal the story: shrinking populations, bones marked by malnutrition, sudden disappearances from once thriving ranges. For humans, this loss was both catastrophe and crucible. As herds declined, the abundance that had once supported entire communities collapsed. The easy harvest of giants gave way to the harder work of hunting smaller game: deer, antelope, rabbits, birds. Fishing gained importance where rivers and coasts allowed, and gathering plants became not a supplement but a necessity. This shift demanded new tools and new strategies. Bows and arrows, though not yet widespread everywhere, began to appear. Nets, traps, and fishing hooks made from bone or antler reflect a growing ingenuity, a diversification of methods that spread risk across many food sources. The human diet broadened, and with it survival gained resilience. Yet something intangible was also lost with the giants. They had been not only food, but symbols. In cave art, mammoths and bison dominate walls drawn with reverence and power. To watch them vanish must have felt like the unravelling of an ancient order, as if the spirits that anchored the world were slipping away. Some archaeologists believe this grief shaped new myths, stories of lost creatures, of vanished lands, of a golden age before scarcity. These myths may still echo faintly in later traditions of floods, cataclysms, and forgotten paradises. Even as ecosystems collapsed, human imagination reached outward. Burial sites from this period reveal a striking investment in ritual. In Sungir, near modern-day Moscow, 2 children were buried side by side around 34,000 years ago, their graves filled with thousands of ivory beads, spears of mammoth bone, and ornaments carefully arranged. Such lavish offerings, given in an age of hunger, suggest a profound belief that life extended beyond death, that survival was not only of the body, but of the soul. These burials tell us that humans were not just clinging to life, they were weaving meaning into death, affirming that the fragile thread of existence was tied to something enduring. This weaving of meaning carried into art and adornment. Carvings of animals, jewellery made from teeth and shells, and painted stones suggest a growing complexity in how humans expressed identity. Ornaments may have marked social roles, kinship ties, or spiritual beliefs, but they also created bonds between groups. A bead traded across miles, a carved figurine passed from hand to hand, became more than an object. It was a signal of trust, of shared humanity, of belonging to a wider network in a world that could so easily isolate. Networks of exchange were critical. Archaeologists have traced obsidian, shells, and pigments, moving hundreds of miles from their sources. Such movement required not only travel but relationships, alliances between groups, agreements to trade rather than fight. In times of scarcity, these networks may have been lifelines, allowing food, tools, or knowledge to flow where it was most needed. This web of interaction gave Homo sapiens an edge, binding far-flung bands into something greater than themselves. Where isolation spelled doom, connection bred resilience. Still, survival was never guaranteed. Illness, injury, and famine haunted every step. The skeletal remains of Ice Age people bear marks of arthritis, broken bones, and infections. Many died young, yet the healed fractures and prolonged survival of the disabled suggest communities that did not abandon their weak. Such care was costly, but it preserved knowledge and fostered loyalty. To protect the vulnerable was to preserve memory, the stories, the skills, the wisdom that could guide the group through storms. In this way, compassion was not weakness, but strength, a quiet force shaping humanity's endurance. And above all, there was the sky. The nights of the Ice Age must have been overwhelming, a vault of stars glittering in the frozen darkness, unpolluted and vast. Patterns would have revealed themselves, constellations forming guides for migration and cycles for ritual. The waxing and waning of the moon marked time, while the slow wheel of the heavens suggested order, even when the earth seemed chaotic. To look upward was to find stability in the cosmos, to anchor hope in patterns larger than storms or hunger. From these skies, myths of creation and destiny likely took shape, their origins grounded in the need to find meaning when the world below was fragile and merciless. The decline of the Ice Age giants was a turning point, forcing humanity into a new mode of survival. Adaptation became diversification, and survival became a matter not of dominating a single prey, but of weaving many threads into a net strong enough to catch life wherever it appeared. But this shift also carried with it a new vulnerability. Smaller prey meant smaller returns. Survival now depended on precision, cooperation, and innovation. A missed shot at a deer or a failed fishing attempt could mean starvation. The balance grew ever more precarious, yet within this precariousness lay the seeds of transformation. Hunting smaller game required more portable weapons, more complex planning, and perhaps new forms of cooperation. Gathering plants required knowledge of seasons and landscapes, an attentiveness to the subtleties of the earth that would one day blossom into agriculture. What seemed like scarcity was also a teacher, shaping minds to think in broader terms, to prepare, to innovate, to imagine possibilities not yet visible. And so, as the winds howled across empty plains where mammoths once roamed, humans stepped into a world both diminished and expanded. Diminished in the loss of giants, but expanded in the skills, connections, and imagination that scarcity demanded. The question that lingered was no longer simply whether humanity could endure the cold, but whether it could learn to reinvent itself in the face of a world that was unravelling. For beyond the horizon, the ice was stirring again, preparing to unleash storms and floods of unimaginable scale, forces that would test not only human endurance, but human ingenuity in ways never before acquired. As the Ice Age deepened, the planet itself became a restless, unpredictable adversary. The balance of survival no longer hinged solely on hunting or gathering, but on responding to the Earth's own violent shifts. Ice sheets creaked and groaned as they advanced across continents, their crushing weight reshaping valleys, redirecting rivers, and pressing mountains beneath them. When the ice retreated, it often did so in chaos, unleashing torrents of meltwater that carved canyons in days, drowned plains, and tore forests from their roots. For the scattered bands of humans living on the edge of these events, survival was a matter of anticipation, of sensing when the earth itself was about to turn against them. One of the most dramatic forces shaping their world was the sudden rise and fall of water. Glacial lakes formed in basins carved by retreating ice, their surfaces deceptively calm but held back by fragile walls of frozen earth. When these walls broke, they unleashed floods so immense they scoured entire regions. In North America, the Missoula floods transformed landscapes overnight. Water raced across the land at speeds faster than galloping horses, stripping away soil, scattering boulders the size of houses and carving scars still visible today. Humans caught in their path would have known only terror. Roaring walls of water, forests collapsing, the sudden erasure of everything familiar. For survivors, these floods must have been branded into memory, passed down as stories of gods of water or monsters of the deep swallowing the land. In Europe and Asia, other catastrophes unfolded. Meltwater from retreating glaciers poured into rivers, causing deluges that drowned valleys and forced migrations. In some places, entire hunting grounds vanished under lakes that stretched for miles. Archaeological traces suggest sudden abandonments of settlements, tools left behind as groups fled rising waters. To leave behind hearths, shelters, and sacred sites was to lose not only material resources, but also the anchors of identity. In such upheaval, memory became fragile, and myth became a way of holding on to what was lost. Stories of floods, of lands swallowed by seas may find their echoes here, in the lived trauma Ice Age catastrophe. Yet water was also a giver of life. When rivers stabilized, their valleys became rich hunting grounds, attracting herds and birds, offering fish to those who learned to cast hooks and nets. Humans who adapted to the rhythm of rivers gained resilience, weaving water into their survival strategies. Fishing communities began to appear, leaving behind barbed points and net weights carved from stone. These tools reveal not desperation but adaptation, a shift toward exploiting resources that were renewable and less dangerous than mammoth hunts. It was a quiet revolution, one that expanded the possibilities of survival in a world where every advantage mattered. But Earth's violence was not confined to floods. Volcanoes too shook the Ice Age world. Ash layers preserved in soil across continents testify to eruptions that darkened skies and poisoned air. The memory of Toba, though distant in time, haunted the descendants of those who survived its aftermath. More localized eruptions scattered across Europe and Asia created disruptions that could last for years. For humans, volcanic ash falling from the sky must have seemed like a curse from unseen powers. Crops of edible plants failed, herds shifted away from poisoned lands, and water turned foul. Yet once again, survival depended on persistence. Ash that destroyed one season could enrich soils for generations to come, and those who endured learned that even catastrophe could eventually become fertility. These cycles of destruction and renewal shaped the human mind as much as the land. To live in constant upheaval was to accept uncertainty as the only constant. It demanded imagination, not just for tools and strategies, but for meaning. The myths of later civilizations, of floods, fire, and chaos before creation, may well be echoes of these Ice Age experiences, memories refracted into symbols to explain a world that often seemed incomprehensible. Myth became both survival strategy and cultural inheritance, teaching generations how to face forces far beyond their control. Meanwhile, daily survival continued in the shadow of these immense events. Hunting smaller game required patience and precision, often in groups that coordinated movements with remarkable skill. Evidence of drive lines, stone arrangements or wooden posts that guided animals into traps reveals sophisticated planning. Fishing demanded knowledge of seasonal cycles, the timing of spawning, the habits of rivers. Gathering plants required intimate awareness of the land, knowing which roots could be eaten raw, which needed processing, and which were deadly poisons. Each of these skills expanded the human relationship with nature, transforming survival from brute endurance into an art of observation. What bound all of this together was memory. Survival in the Ice Age was not a matter of instinct alone, but of knowledge accumulated and transmitted. A group that remembered where herds tended to pass in a certain season, or which valley flooded after heavy snowmelt, held an advantage over those who did not. Oral tradition became as important as stone blades, carrying maps, warnings, and strategies across generations. A story told around a fire might contain not only myth but also instruction: when to move, where to find water, how to avoid danger. In this way, narrative became as essential as any tool, a living archive of survival. Yet even as humans adapted, the cost was immense. Entire species slipped into extinction, ecosystems shifted, and the familiar patterns of life broke apart. The psychological toll must have been profound. To lose prey animals, to see landscapes vanish under ice or water, to witness skies darkened by ash, was to live in a world that seemed perpetually unstable. And yet, in the face of this, humans created continuity where none existed. Burials adorned with beads, carvings etched with symbols, music played on bone flutes. All these acts declared that life had meaning, that identity persisted even when the world unravelled. Archaeological discoveries show that people did not merely endure these trials, but carried beauty with them. A small pendant carved from mammoth ivory, beads fashioned from seashells carried inland hundreds of miles, or figurines representing animals long vanished. These were more than decorations. They were affirmations, anchors of identity in a landscape that constantly shifted. Even in hunger and fear, humans insisted on creating, on shaping symbols that tethered them to one another and to their world. The fragility of the Ice Age was also its teacher. The relentless rhythm of upheaval pushed humanity toward resilience, toward diversification of food sources, toward networks of trade and cooperation that stretched farther than ever before. What might have seemed like endless hardship was in fact sculpting the very traits that would allow humans to thrive long after the ice receded. Flexibility, foresight, imagination, compassion. These were not luxuries, but survival strategies honed in catastrophe. Still, beneath every adaptation lingered an unspoken fear that one day the balance would tip too far, that the storms would not pass, that the floods would not recede, that the herds would never return. To live in the Ice Age was to carry this uncertainty like a shadow, to know that survival was always provisional, always borrowed against forces too vast to master. And yet, humanity endured. Fire still burned in hearths, stories still rose into the night, children still played in caves where their footprints remained preserved in clay. Even in the face of roaring floods and darkened skies, the thread of survival held. But survival was not the same as triumph. Ahead lay challenges that would strip away more than landscapes and species, challenges that would force humanity to confront the fragility of its very identity, and to ask whether resilience could truly protect against a world reshaped beyond recognition. The Ice Age tested humanity with unrelenting cruelty, but it also forged resilience in ways no calm climate could have done. Each storm, each migration, each collapse of prey sharpened not only the body but the mind. Yet survival was never uniform across the globe. Different regions presented different trials, and those who lived within them shaped unique strategies, carving diverse paths toward endurance. It was in this global patchwork of adaptation that humanity's destiny as a species truly began to crystallize. In Europe, where glaciers pressed southward and carved the land into stark contrasts of tundra and forest, humans refined their ability to use caves as sanctuaries. These caverns were more than shelters against the cold. They were repositories of memory, art, and ritual. Paintings of horses, aurochs, mammoths, and lions danced along the walls in flickering torchlight, their forms layered as if painted across generations. Archaeologists studying Lascaux and Chauvet suggest that these places were not simply dwellings, but sacred spaces where the boundaries between survival and meaning blurred. To paint was to claim continuity in a world that offered none. Each brushstroke was a defiance of impermanence, a reminder that humanity was more than its hunger. Farther east, across the Siberian plains, survival took on a different face. Here, in the endless tundra, people constructed shelters from the bones of mammoths, arranging rib cages into domes and covering them with hides. These structures, both practical and monumental, speak to the ingenuity of communities who transformed the remnants of giants into homes. Within their walls, fires burned steadily, children played, and elders shared stories. Such shelters were not mere engineering feats. They were symbols of adaptation, of a people who turned death into continuity, transforming the carcass of a fallen beast into the heartbeat of their own survival. Across the seas and deserts, another story unfolded. In Australia, humans had already arrived tens of thousands of years before the Ice Age reached its peak, and they faced an environment radically different from the frozen north. Here, the threat was not ice, but fire and drought. Megafauna unique to the continent, giant kangaroos, massive reptiles, and flightless birds dominated the landscape. Humans adapted through controlled burning of grasslands, a practice that reshaped ecosystems and ensured the return of food sources. These fire-stick farming techniques reveal that humans were not only surviving, but actively managing environments, creating cycles of renewal in lands that otherwise offered little security. In the Americas, newly arrived populations encountered a land filled with unfamiliar giants. Ground sloths taller than men, saber-toothed cats, and herds of camel-like creatures filled the plains. The first humans here carried with them the legacy of Beringia, stone tools and survival strategies honed across frozen steppes. But they also had to improvise, facing prey that behaved differently, predators they had never seen, and climates that swung between extremes of cold and warmth. Over time, they spread across the hemisphere, leaving evidence of campsites from the Arctic tundra to the tip of South America. This vast dispersal was not the act of conquerors, but of survivors, following rivers, coasts, and game until they had mapped the Americas with footsteps. Africa, meanwhile, remained the foundation stone of humanity's story. While the glaciers never reached its heartlands, the continent endured its own cycles of drought and abundance. Rainfall shifted in unpredictable pulses, shrinking lakes, then swelling them again until they overflowed. Archaeological evidence from caves and lake shores reveals that humans here diversified their diets early, consuming fish, shellfish, roots, and small game alongside larger prey. This dietary flexibility, honed in Africa, became a gift carried across the globe, the ability to survive not only on abundance but on whatever could be found. What unites all these regions is not uniformity, but the thread of adaptation. Survival did not mean following a single path, but weaving many together, each environment demanding different strategies, each group improvising in ways that suited their landscapes. It is this diversity that ensured humanity's endurance. A collapse in one region did not erase the species, because another region held a different solution, another way of enduring the cold. But survival was not merely practical. Across continents, evidence reveals a shared hunger for meaning. The Venus figurines scattered from France to Siberia, small carvings of exaggerated female forms, suggest a symbolic language that spanned thousands of miles. Whether they represented fertility, survival, or something more mysterious, their spread reveals a common thread of imagination. Even in isolation, humans created echoes of one another, as if the act of carving meaning into stone and bone was itself universal. Trade networks stretched across surprising distances, carrying shells from coastlines into the heart of continents, pigments from quarries into caves hundreds of miles away. These exchanges were not merely economic but cultural, threads binding communities into a fragile web of connection. In an age when survival often depended on cooperation, these networks may have been lifelines, ensuring that even the most isolated groups were never entirely alone. And yet the Ice Age remained merciless. The decline of megafauna continued, and with it new pressures emerged. In the Americas, mammoths and mastodons began to vanish soon after humans arrived, their populations collapsing under combined stress of climate change and hunting. In Australia, giant marsupials disappeared in waves, reshaping ecosystems in ways humans could not fully anticipate. Each extinction was both a loss of food and a loss of meaning, forcing humans to adapt yet again, to hunt smaller prey, to fish more, to gather more plants. What once seemed like a land of plenty became over time a land of fragility. This cycle of loss and adaptation shaped not only survival strategies but also memory. Stories of vanished animals may have lived on as myths of monsters or spirits, reminders of a time when giants walked the earth. These tales were not just entertainment, they were ways of holding on to a world that had slipped away, of preserving lessons about abundance, scarcity, and the dangers of over-reliance. In this sense, myth became an archive of extinction, carrying ecological memory across generations. Compassion, too, left its mark. Burial sites show individuals with severe disabilities who lived long past injuries that should have been fatal. This survival implies care, food shared, protection given, burdens carried. In the harsh calculus of Ice Age life, compassion was costly, but it was also transformative. Groups that protected their vulnerable preserved knowledge, reinforced bonds, and built trust strong enough to endure catastrophe. Compassion became as vital as flint and fire, a hidden force shaping the fate of the species. Yet for all these triumphs, an undercurrent of uncertainty never faded. The glaciers still loomed, storms still swept plains without warning, and rivers could vanish or swell in a single season. To live in the Ice Age was to know that tomorrow was never guaranteed, that stability was always an illusion. And so humanity turned to its oldest tool, imagination. In songs played on bone flutes, in figures etched on cave walls, in beads strung across necks, humans declared that survival was more than endurance. It was the act of shaping meaning, of carving permanence into a world that erased everything else. But beyond meaning lay a harder truth. The ice itself was not eternal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the climate shifted again. The great glaciers began to weaken, retreating under a warming sun. With their collapse came floods and chaos greater than anything seen before, reshaping the very face of continents. For humans, the question was no longer whether they could survive the cold, but whether they could survive the flood of change that was about to sweep across the earth. The retreat of the ice was not a gentle thaw, but a convulsion of the earth. As glaciers that had towered for millennia began to weaken, their collapse unleashed chaos on a planetary scale. Walls of ice fractured, sending torrents of meltwater surging across valleys, carving new rivers and drowning ancient plains. Entire landscapes shifted within the span of a single generation, leaving humans and animals alike scrambling to adjust. For those who lived through it, the end of the Ice Age must have felt less like liberation and more like the unravelling of the world itself. The evidence of this upheaval lies scattered across the continents. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet melted with terrifying force, releasing floods from glacial lakes that dwarfed modern seas. One of the largest, Lake Agassiz, stretched for hundreds of miles, and when its icy dam burst, the flood surged into the oceans with volumes that could alter global sea levels in a matter of days. Geologists have traced the scars of these floods. Channels gouged into bedrock, boulders carried for miles, shorelines etched high above modern lakes. For humans hunting along those valleys, the collapse would have been catastrophic. Camps vanished, prey scattered, and entire migrations had to be abandoned overnight. Similar events unfolded across Europe and Asia. In Siberia, rivers once steady with seasonal flow swelled into raging torrents as ice sheets retreated, cutting new channels that divided hunting territories. In what is now the North Sea, a great plain called Doggerland connected Britain to continental Europe. This land, rich with rivers and herds, became a home for generations of humans. But as the ice melted and seas rose, Doggerland drowned beneath waves, leaving behind only scattered islands. For those who watched their homeland vanish beneath encroaching tides, the loss must have been incomprehensible. Stories of rising seas, of land swallowed whole, echo faintly in later myths of floods and lost worlds, echoes of memories carried across centuries. With every retreat of the ice, the earth exhaled. Forests pushed northward into lands once barren tundra, filling valleys with birch and pine, then oak and hazel. The steppe tundra, once the vast stage for mammoths and bison, began to fragment. As trees spread, open grassland shrank, and the herds that had defined Ice Age life dwindled. This shift was not simply environmental, it struck at the heart of human survival. The great beasts that had fed, clothed and sheltered communities for millennia were disappearing, not just from hunting prey, but because the ecosystems that sustained them were collapsing. For the hunters who painted mammoths on cave walls, their disappearance was more than a practical loss. It was a spiritual fracture. To see the animals vanish was to watch the very fabric of the world unravel. In response, humans adapted again. Instead of following mammoths across open plains, they began stalking deer in forests, fishing in rivers, and gathering nuts, fruits and roots from the expanding woodlands. This transition demanded new tools, microliths. Small sharp blades that could be set into wood or bone to form arrows, barbed harpoons and composite tools. Such innovations allowed humans to thrive in environments where giants no longer roamed. The changing landscapes also reshaped human movement. Coastal plains drowned, forcing migrations inland or uphill. Forests grew dense, altering travel routes, and obscuring the sight lines that had once guided hunters across open tundra. Rivers shifted, some drying up, others flooding, and each transformation redrew the map of survival. In this chaos, mobility once again became salvation. Groups that could adapt routes, abandon drowned valleys, or exploit new resources endured, while those who clung too tightly to old ways faced starvation. But adaptation was not only technological, it was social. Communities grew more complex as survival strategies diversified. The need to share knowledge about new food sources, new tools, and new landscapes strengthened bonds between groups. Exchange networks expanded, carrying obsidian, shells, pigments, and tools across vast distances. These networks were not only for trade, but for survival, ensuring that innovation spread quickly. In a world where change was constant, the ability to learn from others became as vital as the ability to hunt. Archaeological discoveries reveal that this period saw the growth of ritual and symbolism. Burials became more elaborate, with beads, carvings, and ochre adorning the dead. Carved figurines, decorated tools, and painted stones proliferated, suggesting that as the physical world shifted unpredictably, humans sought stability and meaning. Rituals provided continuity when landscapes vanished. Symbols preserved identity when prey disappeared. To carve a figure or paint a wall was to assert permanence in a world where permanence no longer existed. At the same time, climate instability brought moments of sudden brutality. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth entered a period known as the Younger Dryas, a dramatic return to glacial conditions after centuries of warming. Ice sheets advanced once again, temperatures plummeted, and ecosystems collapsed. The cause remains debated. Perhaps a disruption of ocean currents from meltwater floods, perhaps the impact of a comet or asteroid. But the effect was devastating. For humans who had begun to adapt to forests and rising seas, this abrupt plunge back into cold must have felt like betrayal, as if the earth itself had turned against them. Crops of plants failed, herds diminished, and famine returned with a vengeance. Survival once again demanded the endurance of an Ice Age world just when humanity thought it was escaping. The Younger Dryas tested the resilience forged over millennia, yet it also marked a turning point. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, groups of humans began experimenting with a radical strategy, not simply gathering plants but cultivating them. Evidence of early cereal cultivation appears in this period, suggesting that the instability of climate pushed humans toward new solutions. Hunting and gathering remained essential, but the seeds of agriculture, quite literally, were being planted in the crucible of chaos. Elsewhere, fishing and small game hunting intensified, with humans devising increasingly specialized tools. Nets, fish traps, and bows became common, reflecting a diversification of subsistence strategies that mirrored the complexity of changing ecosystems. These shifts did not happen overnight, but across generations they altered the trajectory of human existence. Through it all, memory remained the guiding force. Oral traditions passed across firesides and cave walls carried lessons of floods, storms, and the disappearance of prey. These stories were not just cautionary tales, they were survival guides, embedding ecological knowledge in narrative form. Myths of floods, myths of gods withdrawing or returning, myths of animals disappearing, all carried echoes of real events, translated into symbols that preserved their meaning across centuries. And in those myths was a warning. The world could shift in an instant. To endure, humans needed not only strength and tools, but also the humility to adapt, to accept that control was an illusion, and survival belonged to those who moved with change rather than against it. As the ice retreated and surged, as forests spread and seas rose, humanity stood at a threshold. The last ice age was ending, but the new world it revealed was no less perilous. Floods, famine, and the extinction of giants had stripped away the illusions of permanence. What remained was a species that had learned to endure uncertainty, to transform chaos into meaning, and to imagine futures beyond survival. Ahead lay the dawn of new ways of living, ways that would not merely adapt to nature but begin to reshape it, carrying with them both the resilience of the past and the shadow of new vulnerabilities yet to come. The waning of the Ice Age was not a single moment, but a drawn-out transformation, a slow awakening of the Earth after tens of thousands of years in deep freeze. As glaciers retreated, landscapes that had long been sealed under ice revealed themselves again, valleys filled with rivers, plains unfurling into meadows, forests creeping northward like advancing armies of green. For humans, these changes carried both promise and peril. New opportunities for food appeared, but so too did unfamiliar challenges, and each shift in the land demanded fresh strategies for survival. Where mammoths once roamed across open tundra, now forests closed in, filling the horizon with birch, pine, and oak. The great beasts that had sustained humans for generations began to vanish, not because of a single hunt or sudden collapse, but because their world was unravelling. Mammoths and mastodons, adapted to the vast grasslands of the steppe, could not thrive in dense woodlands. Giant deer, with their massive antlers spanning wider than a man's reach, struggled to navigate the new forests. As ecosystems transformed, their numbers dwindled, until the thunder of hooves and the crash of antlers faded into silence. For humans, this extinction was more than the loss of food. It was the erasure of companions, adversaries, and symbols that had defined life itself. The mammoth, painted on cave walls with reverence, carved into ivory figurines, sung about in chants around fires, was not just prey. It was woven into identity. To see it vanish was to feel the foundations of existence tremble. And yet, necessity forced adaptation. People turned to new sources of sustenance: red deer, wild boar, aurochs, the formidable wild ancestors of cattle, and countless smaller animals that darted through the undergrowth of the spreading forests. This shift reshaped tools and techniques. Hunting in open tundra required coordination to drive herds into traps or against cliffs. Hunting in forests demanded stealth, patience, and weapons suited to close quarters. Arrows tipped with microliths, small sharp blades, became vital, piercing through thickets where spears were less effective. Nets and snares grew more common, capturing rabbits, birds, and fish. Each innovation reflected not only necessity but ingenuity, as humans transformed scarcity into opportunity by expanding the boundaries of what could be eaten. Plants too grew in importance. The forests offered nuts, berries, and roots, resources that required knowledge and timing to exploit. Foraging became a skill passed from elders to children, woven into oral traditions that taught which berries could heal, which roots nourished, which plants poisoned. This deeper relationship with plants laid the foundation for what would eventually become agriculture, though for now it remained a careful partnership with the wild. The gathering of hazelnuts, acorns, and wild grains supplemented hunting, and over time the rhythm of the seasons began to shape human life more profoundly than the migrations of herds. The changing climate also altered human settlements. With less need to follow herds across vast distances, some groups began to linger longer in fertile valleys, returning to the same places season after season. Archaeological sites reveal structures more permanent than before, storage pits dug into the ground, and middens filled with shells and bones from repeated occupation. The seeds of sedentary life were being sown, not yet agriculture, but the beginnings of a new relationship with place, one rooted in cycles of return, in memory tied to specific landscapes. These semi-permanent settlements fostered something else: complexity. When groups stayed longer in one place, populations grew. With growth came new social dynamics, hierarchies, and perhaps even conflicts over territory. The sharing of food, once essential in small mobile bands, now became more intricate. Who controlled resources? Who led hunts? Who decided when to move? These questions took on weight in ways they had not before. The Ice Age had demanded cooperation for survival, but the post-glacial world demanded negotiation, leadership, and the management of relationships within larger communities. At the same time, rituals deepened. Burials became more elaborate, with grave goods increasing in number and variety. Carved pendants, beads, and decorated tools suggest that identity was not only personal, but communal, that social roles and status were acknowledged even in death. This investment in the dead points to a worldview in which survival was not merely about the body, but about continuity of memory, about linking the living to the ancestors who had endured before them. The changing environment also inspired new forms of art. Rock carvings and engravings, distinct from the cave paintings of earlier millennia, appeared in open landscapes, depicting animals, human figures, and abstract patterns. These carvings suggest that as humans spent more time in the open, their art expanded beyond hidden caves into public spaces, perhaps marking territory, commemorating events, or invoking spirits tied to new landscapes. The world was no longer only about survival in darkness, but about shaping identity in light. Yet the retreat of the ice carried dangers as well. Rising seas drowned coasts, swallowing lands that had once been rich hunting grounds. Doggerland, the vast plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe, became a memory, its rivers and lakes buried beneath waves. For the people who lived there, the sea's slow but relentless advance must have seemed both mysterious and merciless. Entire communities were forced to move inland, carrying with them stories of the sea's hunger. These stories, passed from generation to generation, may have echoed into later myths of deluges and worlds lost beneath the ocean. Floods were not the only threat. The shifting climate brought unpredictable weather, storms of rain, sudden droughts, violent winters that returned without warning. Scientists today trace these swings in ice cores, revealing abrupt shifts of temperature within decades. For those living through it, such changes were incomprehensible. A valley lush with food one generation could wither the next. A river that once sustained fish could dry or flood beyond use. To survive in such instability required not just tools and strength, but an acceptance of impermanence, a readiness to move, to improvise, to abandon and rebuild. But even amid these challenges, something profound was emerging. The human capacity not only to endure change, but to anticipate it. Stories around the fire, myths of floods and vanishing animals, encoded memory in ways that prepare communities for future upheavals. By transforming experience into narrative, humans created resilience not tied to individuals but to culture itself. Knowledge became portable, carried in words and rituals as surely as in tools. This cultural resilience was perhaps humanity's greatest adaptation. Where animals relied on instinct, humans relied on imagination, crafting strategies that stretched beyond the immediate present into the uncertain future. To remember was to survive, but to imagine was to thrive. It was this imagination that allowed them to see opportunity in new plants, to create tools for new prey, to ritualize meaning when old certainties vanished. And yet, as forests spread, seas rose and the great beast disappeared, the question lingered. What came next? The Ice Age had forged humanity in fire and frost, but now the world was softening, reshaping itself into forms unfamiliar. Would humanity cling to old ways, chasing dwindling herds and vanishing giants? Or would it step into a new relationship with the earth, one not of endless wandering but of deeper rooting, of shaping the land as much as being shaped by it? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, in the first fragile steps toward agriculture, in the taming of plants and animals, in the birth of settlements that would become villages and then cities. The Ice Age was ending, but the story it had written into human bones, resilience, adaptability, imagination, would carry forward into this new dawn. What began as survival was becoming destiny. The retreat of the great ice sheets marked not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. As glaciers melted, the earth was reshaped into landscapes unlike any humans had ever seen. Rivers carved by torrents of meltwater twisted across continents, vast forests spread northward, and coastlines shifted dramatically as seas rose. What had once been open plains of mammoth steppe transformed into patchworks of woodland, wetland, and new coastal estuaries brimming with fish. The world itself seemed to be reborn, yet for the people who lived through this transition, rebirth carried as much danger as promise. The loss of the mammoth steppe was especially profound. This biome had stretched across Eurasia and North America like an endless sea of grasses, sustaining herds of giant herbivores and the predators, including humans, who depended on them. Its disappearance was not simply an ecological shift, but a cultural rupture. Entire ways of life, honed over millennia, began to collapse as the prey animals dwindled. Hunters who had once stalked mammoths with coordination and courage now found themselves in forests where stealth replaced spectacle, and smaller, swifter prey demanded new weapons and tactics. In these environments, bows and arrows, atlatls, spear throwers, and fine-tipped microlithic tools became essential, marking a technological revolution that redefined the art of the hunt. Fishing, too, became central. Rising seas flooded valleys and carved estuaries, creating brackish environments rich in aquatic life. Archaeological sites along ancient shorelines preserve fish bones, net weights, and harpoons fashioned from antler and bone, evidence that humans turned their focus toward the waters. Shell middens, vast heaps of discarded shells, testify to communities that gathered mussels, clams, and oysters in abundance. Where mammoth bones had once anchored shelters, fish and shellfish now sustained villages, tying survival not to herds that roamed unpredictably, but to waters that pulsed with tides. Gathering plants rose in importance as forests spread. Berries, nuts, tubers, and wild grains became staples, their seasonal cycles shaping the rhythm of life. Hazelnuts, preserved by fire in ancient hearths, reveal large-scale harvesting and storage, suggesting that people were beginning to plan beyond the immediate season. Wild barley and wheat in the Fertile Crescent hint at even greater changes to come, for here humans began not only to gather but to cultivate. Though still in its earlier stages, this quiet revolution foreshadowed agriculture, a transformation that would alter humanity's relationship with the earth forever. With these new resources came new forms of settlement. Nomadism, once essential in tracking vast herds, began to give way to semi-permanent camps near rivers, lakes, and coasts. Archaeological remains show structures built not only for shelter, but for durability. Post holes from wooden huts, storage pits dug into the ground, and evidence of repeated occupation spanning generations. This stability fostered new social dynamics. Populations grew, and with them came more complex forms of cooperation, negotiation, and perhaps conflict. Who controlled access to rivers rich in fish? Who decided when to burn forests to encourage new growth? These questions hinted at the beginnings of social hierarchies and territoriality, seeds of the societies yet to come. As humans settled longer in one place, their art and rituals also changed. Cave paintings, once concentrated in hidden chambers, gave way to carvings and engravings on open rock surfaces. Geometric patterns, spirals, and animal figures etched into stone across Europe and Asia suggest a shift in symbolic expression, perhaps marking territory, perhaps communicating across communities. Burials grew even more elaborate, with beads, pendants, and decorated tools accompanying the dead. These practices reveal that meaning was not confined to survival. It extended into memory and identity, binding the living to the past and to each other. Yet this new world was far from stable. The Younger Dryas, that sudden return to glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, had left scars in memory. People knew that warming could be followed by brutal cold without warning, and this knowledge shaped their strategies. Oral traditions likely carried tales of sudden famine, of rivers freezing, of herds vanishing, reminding each generation that nature was fickle. To live in such uncertainty was to carry vigilance as a constant companion, always preparing for the possibility that abundance could collapse. The very unpredictability of the post-glacial world may have driven experimentation. In the Fertile Crescent, the gathering of wild cereals became deliberate planting, an attempt to control food rather than chase it. In Eastern Asia, rice and millet began their own journey toward domestication. In the Americas, wild gourds, beans, and squash were collected and nurtured, setting the stage for the rise of farming societies millennia later. These early experiments were fragile, easily undone by drought, pests, or floods. Yet they represented a radical shift in human imagination. The belief that the earth could be shaped, not merely endured. This belief extended to animals as well. Dogs, already companions since the Ice Age, became partners in hunting and guardians of settlements. Their ability to sense prey, warn of danger, and share warmth in winter bound them tightly to human survival. The bones of dogs found buried alongside humans suggest a bond deeper than utility, a companionship that carried emotional as well as practical weight. This partnership foreshadowed the domestication of other animals, sheep, goats, cattle, that would soon transform human life. Even as new strategies emerged, the psychological toll of extinction lingered. To live through the vanishing of mammoths, cave lions, and giant deer was to witness the unravelling of an ancient order. For communities whose myths and rituals were tied to these creatures, their disappearance was not only ecological loss, but spiritual crisis. Did they imagine that the spirits of these animals retreated into the forests, or that the gods themselves had withdrawn their gifts? Did they carve new myths to explain why giants had fallen silent? Whatever the answers, the loss-shaped memory, embedding itself in stories that spoke of vanished worlds and creatures of legend. Amid these shifts, the stars continued to wheel above, steady when the earth below was anything but. For Ice Age survivors, the sky was a map and a mystery, a constant in a world of change. Constellations guided migration, lunar cycles shaped rituals, and eclipses must have filled the night with awe or terror. As people settled, their relationship with the heavens deepened, anchoring time in predictable patterns, even as rivers and forests transformed. From this bond with the sky would emerge the calendars, temples, and cosmologies of later civilizations, but its roots stretched back to the firelit nights of a world still haunted by ice. In this fragile balance of loss and innovation, humanity stood at a threshold. The Ice Age was ending, but its lessons were etched into bone, story, and culture. Resilience was no longer just the ability to endure cold and hunger. It was the ability to reinvent survival itself. And as the forests thickened and seas crept higher, humans carried forward not only tools and techniques, but also imagination, compassion, and memory. The true inheritance of the Ice Age. Yet beyond the tree lines and swelling rivers, the earth still stirred with upheaval. Volcanoes, storms, and floods continued to rewrite landscapes, reminding humans that even in a warming world, stability was an illusion. The question was no longer only how to endure nature's trials, but how to shape a future where survival could mean more than mere endurance. As the Ice Age receded and the world tilted toward warmth, humanity found itself walking into landscapes that seemed altogether new. The glaciers that had once dictated every rhythm of life now retreated into the northernmost edges of the continents, leaving behind scars etched deep into the earth, valleys gouged by ice, fields of boulders abandoned by retreating sheets, lakes filling hollows carved over tens of thousands of years. To early humans, these newly revealed lands must have felt both alien and full of promise. Raw, unsettled places where survival demanded new ways of living. The loss of the great herds forced people to reimagine existence. Where mammoth and bison had once thundered across endless grasslands, smaller animals now defined the hunt. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar and aurochs threaded their paths through forests that spread steadily northward. In response, hunters honed stealth over endurance, patience over pursuit. The bow and arrow, first appearing near the twilight of the Ice Age, grew more widespread, revolutionizing hunting. Lightweight and deadly at a distance, bows allowed hunters to slip quietly through the undergrowth, striking from concealment. This weapon did more than shift tactics. It reshaped the balance of survival, offering a tool as adaptable as the humans who wielded it. Yet humans did not only follow animals, they also began to follow plants. The forests yielded nuts and berries in abundance, and rivers swollen with meltwater filled with salmon, trout, and freshwater mussels. Along coasts, tidal flats and estuaries offered clams, oysters, and fish, creating food sources that were stable and renewable. Shell middens left behind on ancient shorelines reveal not occasional meals, but sustained harvesting over generations, evidence of people adapting their diet to the rhythms of the sea. For the first time, survival was no longer tethered entirely to the migrations of land animals, but diversified across ecosystems. This diversification built resilience, ensuring that the loss of one food source did not spell disaster. With new food came new patterns of settlement. Instead of constant pursuit of herds, groups lingered longer in fertile valleys, along rivers, or by lake shores. Archaeological sites show traces of dwellings constructed from wood and reeds, sturdier and more permanent than the hide tents of earlier millennia. Hearths were rebuilt season after season, storage pits dug into the soil, and cemeteries established nearby. These semi-permanent settlements represented more than convenience. They were the beginning of rooted life, of humans tying their memory and identity to particular landscapes. This change in rhythm had profound consequences. When people returned to the same places again and again, they developed a deeper relationship with those landscapes. They learned the timing of salmon runs, the flowering of plants, the migration of birds. They burned sections of forest to encourage new growth, altering ecosystems in subtle but lasting ways. This was not yet farming, but it was a step toward ecological management, a recognition that humans could shape the land as much as be shaped by it. The transformation was cultural as well as practical. Art, once confined to deep caves hidden from the sun, emerged in new forms. Carved stones and open-air rock engravings began to appear, depicting not only animals but abstract patterns, spirals, and lines. These motifs suggest new symbolic languages, perhaps tied to territories, rituals, or the tracking of time. Portable art also flourished. Beads strung from shells carried far inland, figurines carved from bone or antler, pendants of amber polished to a sheen. These objects were not mere ornaments but symbols of belonging, linking individuals to groups and communities in a world that was growing more interconnected. Burial practices too deepened in complexity. The graves of the post-Ice Age period often contain carefully arranged goods, tools, ornaments and pigments like red ochre sprinkled over the dead. These rituals suggest a worldview in which life and death were part of a continuum, in which the dead continued to share in the life of the community. To invest in the dead in times of hardship was an act of faith, a declaration that survival was more than bodily endurance. It was memory, identity, continuity. Yet the world remained unstable. Climate fluctuations, though less severe than during the height of the Ice Age, still carried danger. Sudden droughts withered plants, rivers flooded unpredictably, and storms lashed coasts with fury. Archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements speaks to communities forced to move when resources collapsed. The lessons of the Ice Age, mobility, flexibility, cooperation, remained essential even as humans began to root themselves more deeply in place. In the Fertile Crescent, the pressure of instability pushed innovation even further. There, groups began to experiment with cultivating wild cereals like barley and wheat. Archaeological remains of grinding stones and storage pits filled with charred grains suggest that humans were not only gathering, but deliberately planting, nurturing, and harvesting. This was the dawn of agriculture, fragile and tentative, born from the necessity of surviving in landscapes that could no longer be trusted to provide. The shift from gathering to cultivation was not an abrupt revolution, but a slow, experimental process, one carried forward by the memory of scarcity and the hope of stability. Meanwhile, animals too began to enter into new relationships with humans. Dogs, long companions of hunters, became more deeply integrated into daily life, guarding camps, helping with hunts, and providing warmth in cold nights. Other animals, goats, sheep, cattle, lingered near human settlements, their presence slowly transforming into domestication. At first, humans may have tolerated them for the convenience of nearby meat or milk, but over generations the relationship deepened into mutual dependence. Domestication was not a single decision but a gradual entanglement, a recognition that survival could be built not only on hunting but on partnership. As societies grew more complex, so too did their conflicts. With semi-permanent settlements came questions of territory, of who controlled fertile valleys or rich fishing grounds. Archaeological evidence of violence, fractured skulls, spear points lodged in bones, fortifications built from wood, suggest that competition sometimes turned deadly. Yet exchange and cooperation flourished alongside conflict. Networks of trade carried flint, obsidian, shells, and pigments across hundreds of miles, weaving distant groups into fragile webs of interaction. Survival was increasingly collective, dependent on the flow of knowledge and resources across landscapes. Even as they navigated these new realities, humans never stopped seeking meaning. The heavens, constant above the shifting earth, offered patterns of reassurance. The rising of stars and the phases of the moon became markers of time, guiding planting, gathering, and ritual. Some of the earliest stone monuments, aligned with celestial events, date to this period, suggesting that humanity was beginning to inscribe its sense of order, not only on land, but also in the sky. To look upward was to find stability when the world below was uncertain, to see in the heavens a mirror of human hopes and fears. The retreat of the Ice Age did not bring peace, but it brought transformation. Humans were no longer only hunters of giants or wanderers of tundra. They were becoming shapers of land, cultivators of plants, partners of animals. Yet even as these shifts took root, uncertainty remained. Floods still swept away settlements, storms still tore through forests, and the memory of vanished mammoths lingered in myths and art. The lesson of the Ice Age, that survival was inseparable from adaptability, remained etched into every choice, every ritual, every tool. And as rivers carried silt into fertile plains, as seeds sprouted under human hands, and as villages grew where once there had been only camps, a new question emerged. Could humanity not only endure change, but master it? Could the fragile species that had barely survived the grip of ice now take hold of the earth itself, bending its rhythms toward permanence? The first steps of that answer were already underway, hidden in the careful tending of wild plants, in the corralling of animals, in the fires that cleared forests. What began as survival was becoming something more radical, the transformation of the planet itself into a human world. The end of the Ice Age opened the door to abundance, but abundance carried its own dangers. For tens of thousands of years, survival had been defined by scarcity and mobility, by the relentless pursuit of prey and the constant shifting of camps. Now, as glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, landscapes stabilized into fertile valleys, broad river basins and lush coasts. Food sources multiplied. Fish swarmed in rivers, deer wandered through forests, Wild grains ripened in meadows. Humans, long conditioned to endure hunger, found themselves surrounded by new opportunities. But abundance is a double-edged gift. It encourages permanence, and permanence reshapes not only survival strategies, but the very fabric of society. Semi-permanent settlements became more common in the post-glacial world. Along rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates and Nile, people began to linger year after year, drawn by fertile floodplains and predictable cycles of renewal. On the coasts of the Mediterranean, shell middens grew into towering heaps, layered evidence of generations harvesting mussels and oysters. In Central Europe, wooden huts were built and rebuilt in the same clearings, their hearths accumulating centuries of ash. These were no longer mere campsites, but homes, places imbued with memory, where births, deaths and rituals wove together into the beginnings of community identity. With this rootedness came profound changes. Populations grew as stability allowed more children to survive. Larger groups required new forms of cooperation, but also introduced tensions, disputes over territory, over access to water or fertile land, over who controlled the bounty of a hunt or the harvest of nuts. Violence, once sporadic, may have become more organised, and archaeological evidence of fortified settlements suggests that defence became part of survival. Yet alongside conflict there was flourishing. Networks of exchange expanded, carrying obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Mediterranean, and pigments from distant quarries. These exchanges were not merely economic, they created webs of cultural connection, weaving distant groups into shared traditions. Technology, too, adapted to this new rhythm. Microliths, once fitted into arrows and spears for hunting smaller prey, were now hafted into sickles to harvest wild cereals. Grinding stones appeared in archaeological layers, their surfaces worn smooth by the processing of grains into flour. Storage pits lined with clay or stone reveal the first tentative attempts at controlling food supplies over seasons. These innovations hint at the earlier steps toward agriculture, born not in a single leap but in gradual experiments across generations. The relationship with plants deepened, but so too did the bond with animals. Dogs had long been companions, but now goats, sheep, and cattle began to move closer to human settlements. At first they were prey of convenience, but over time a more profound shift occurred. Humans noticed that herds could be controlled, their movements guided, their young nurtured for predictable returns of meat, milk or hide. Domestication was not a single invention, but a slow entanglement, an evolving partnership that reshaped ecosystems. By drawing animals into their orbit, humans began to weave themselves into new webs of dependency, both expanding and complicating their survival. The psychological landscape changed as profoundly as the physical one. Where once survival had meant constant motion, now permanence created memory tied to place. Grave sites within or near settlements became common, embedding ancestors into the soil of home. Red ochre, beads and ornaments adorned the dead, affirming that the land itself was a repository of identity. Rituals shifted from caves deep in the earth to open-air sites and stone circles, as communities sought to anchor their beliefs in the landscapes they now claimed. The first hints of monumental architecture, stone alignments, ceremonial enclosures, suggest that humans were beginning to transform not only their daily survival, but their cosmos, inscribing meaning onto the land itself. The stars above continued to serve as guide and mystery. But with rooted life, their significance deepened into calendars. The rising of constellations, the phases of the moon, the solstices and equinoxes, all became markers of time tied to cycles of planting, harvesting and ritual. To look upward was no longer only to navigate migration but to organize community life, to inscribe celestial order onto earthly existence. This was the seedbed of astronomy, born from the need to impose structure on a world of abundance as surely as scarcity, yet abundance did not erase fragility. Climate shift still carried danger, and rising seas continue to transform coasts. Doggerland, once a rich hunting ground, was steadily drowned by encroaching tides. In the Black Sea basin, rising waters may have surged through narrow straits, flooding valleys and forcing entire communities to flee. For those who watched their world vanish beneath waves, the trauma must have been searing. Oral traditions of floods, preserved across countless cultures, may carry echoes of these moments, memories transmuted into myth to preserve the lessons of impermanence. Disease also emerged as a new adversary. In larger, denser settlements, pathogens had more opportunity to spread. Bones from this period show signs of infections and malnutrition, evidence that sedentary life carried costs alongside benefits. Dependency on fewer food sources could lead to famine if harvests failed, and close contact with animals introduced new illnesses. For the first time, humans faced not only the dangers of predators and storms, but the invisible peril of disease woven into the fabric of their communities. Despite these risks, imagination flourished. Artifacts from this time include pendants carved with intricate designs, polished stone axes, and figurines that blend human and animal forms. These creations reveal a symbolic richness that went beyond utility, suggesting mythologies in which humans and animals were intertwined, in which survival was framed as partnership rather than dominance. The idea that the world was shared, that spirits inhabited rivers, forests, and beasts, may have been a way to impose harmony on a reality still fraught with unpredictability. And within this flowering of imagination, seeds of agriculture took deeper root. The deliberate planting of cereals, the selective gathering of seeds, the tending of animals, all were experiments born of necessity and sustained by hope. What had once been an endless struggle to follow nature was becoming a tentative attempt to shape it. The implications of this shift were immense. By anchoring themselves to fields and herds, humans were stepping into a future where survival depended less on movement and more on management. This was not yet the age of kingdoms, but the whispers of villages, and in time cities, could already be heard in the crackling fires of these early settlements. Still, questions lingered in every hearth, every burial, every myth. Could humans truly control the rhythms of the earth, or were they only reshaping fragility into new forms? Would abundance shield them from famine, or entangle them in dependencies more dangerous than hunger itself? The answers lay hidden in the seeds they planted and the herds they gathered, in choices that would ripple through generations. As forests thickened, rivers shifted, and seas continued to rise, humanity stood on the threshold of transformation. The Ice Age had forged resilience through scarcity, but the post-Ice Age world demanded resilience through abundance. The old lessons of mobility, adaptability, and cooperation remained vital, yet they were being tested in new ways. The story of survival was no longer about fleeing glaciers or pursuing mammoths across the steppe. It was about building permanence in a world that remained at its core unpredictable. And beyond the edge of permanence, a new horizon beckoned. The first true villages, the first planted fields, the first domesticated herds. Out of the ashes of ice and the silence of vanished giants, humanity was about to cross into an era not merely of survival, but of invention, setting in motion the great experiment that would come to define its destiny. As humanity stepped into the post-glacial world, the echoes of the Ice Age still reverberated through every choice. The memory of scarcity lingered, shaping how people approached abundance. For countless generations, survival had meant constant vigilance, an awareness that prey could vanish, that storms could descend without warning, that rivers could freeze or flood in a single season. Now, even as forests thickened and rivers flowed more steadily, that ancient fear never fully faded. It pressed humans to innovate, to prepare for uncertainty, and to weave resilience into the very fabric of daily life. In fertile valleys, small communities began to cluster. The patterns of settlement shifted from temporary encampments to enduring villages, places where hearths burned not for days or weeks but for generations. Archaeological sites reveal circular houses built from timber and stone, their foundations rebuilt again and again in the same spots. These dwellings were more than shelters. They were statements of continuity, proof that humans were beginning to anchor themselves to particular landscapes with an intensity unknown during the Ice Age. This stability gave rise to something profound: surplus. When harvests of wild grains were plentiful, when fishing runs overflowed rivers with salmon, when nuts and berries were gathered in abundance, communities began to store food. Storage pits lined with clay, woven baskets hardened by fire, and early granaries reveal the beginnings of foresight turned into infrastructure. To store food was to create security against famine, but it was also to create inequality. Some families or groups controlled more than others, and the seeds of hierarchy were sown alongside the seeds of agriculture. The management of resources demanded cooperation on a scale larger than before. Irrigation channels dug into fertile floodplains, controlled burns to clear forests, coordinated hunts in shrinking open meadows, all required planning and leadership. These early experiments in collective labour forged the basis of governance, not yet kings or councils, but elders, leaders, and specialists whose voices carried weight. The rhythms of survival were no longer just about following nature, but about organising people, and this organisation carried both strength and tension. Meanwhile, the spiritual dimension of life deepened. Ritual sites grew more elaborate, suggesting that as people anchored themselves to land, they also anchored their beliefs to specific places. Stone circles, megalithic alignments, and communal burial mounds appear in the archaeological record, their construction demanding cooperation beyond mere survival. These monuments were not functional shelters or tools, they were symbolic architectures, built to bind communities to one another and to the cosmos. Aligned with solstices or celestial patterns, they reveal an emerging worldview in which human time was linked to cosmic time, in which survival was framed within the order of the heavens. The stories told around fires must have carried new weight. Myths of floods, of vanished animals, of gods who controlled rain and fertility, became explanations for the unpredictable rhythms of the earth. In these myths, memory of the Ice Age likely persisted. Tales of a world of ice, of giants who once walked the land, of storms that swallowed valleys. To remember through story was to prepare for recurrence, to encode survival lessons in the fabric of culture. In this way, myth functioned as both memory and prophecy, warning future generations that the earth could always turn again. The bond with animals also transformed. Dogs, already companions for thousands of years, became indispensable partners in herding as well as hunting. Sheep and goats were tamed more deliberately, their young raised close to human settlements, their milk and wool slowly woven into daily life. Cattle, once formidable aurochs hunted with risk and reverence, began their slow journey toward domestication. This shift altered not only diet but culture. Animals became more than prey. They became cohabitants, participants in a shared destiny. Ritual burials of dogs, figurines of cattle, and carvings of sheep suggest that these relationships were not merely practical but spiritual, binding human identity to animal kinship. Yet these new entanglements carried dangers. Denser settlements and closer contact with animals opened the door to diseases that spread quickly. Archaeological evidence shows signs of tuberculosis, parasites, and nutritional deficiencies in communities experimenting with agriculture. The resilience of nomadic bands gave way to new vulnerabilities, as reliance on fewer food sources could collapse under drought or blight. The experiment of permanence carried risks as profound as the dangers of wandering, and humanity was forced to navigate this new balance between security and fragility. Trade networks expanded with startling speed. Obsidian blades from Anatolia appear in settlements hundreds of miles away. Shells from Mediterranean coasts are found deep inland, and pigments travelled across mountains and valleys. These exchanges were not only about materials but about knowledge. Farming techniques, tool-making strategies, and ritual practices spread along these routes, weaving a web of communication that bound humanity into a more unified fabric. For the first time, ideas could travel as far as objects, ensuring that innovations born in one valley could ripple outward to shape distant communities. The social fabric grew more intricate. With larger populations and permanent settlements came specialized roles: hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, shamans, traders. Division of labor allowed greater efficiency, but also introduced new hierarchies. Some became gatekeepers of resources, others guardians of ritual knowledge, others leaders in conflict. Inequality, which had been muted in small mobile bands, now began to widen. Graves filled with ornaments of beads, pendants, and finely crafted weapons suggest that status was marked even in death, that identity had become tied not only to survival, but to social position. And still, the environment reminded humans of their fragility. Rising seas swallowed coastlines, storms swept across fertile plains, and occasional returns of cold hinted that the ice could still strike back. In northern Europe, the melting of ice sheets triggered immense floods, sending tsunamis racing across coastlines. In Asia and Africa, shifting rains alternated between abundance and drought, shaping cycles of plenty and famine. Each catastrophe tested the balance of permanence, forcing communities to abandon fields, rebuild settlements, or migrate once again. The lesson of the Ice Age, the change was the only constant, remained painfully true. Despite these challenges, imagination soared. Artifacts from this period reveal stunning creativity. Polished stone axes that gleamed like mirrors, figurines carved with precision, jewellery crafted from amber and turquoise. These were not objects of necessity but of meaning, expressions of identity and aspiration. The making of beauty in a world still fraught with danger testifies to humanity's determination to define itself beyond survival, to seek significance even when storms threatened. The heavens too became canvases of meaning. Communities aligned their monuments with solstices, marking the return of the sun as an anchor in cycles of life and death. To track stars was to track time, to impose order on chaos, to bind survival to the rhythm of the cosmos. These alignments suggest the earliest glimmers of cosmology, an awareness that human fate was tied not only to the earth, but to the vast mysterious sky. And so, humanity stood at a threshold. The Ice Age had ended, but its memory remained etched in every story, every ritual, every choice to plant a seed or build a stone circle. The resilience forged in cold and scarcity was now being tested in abundance and permanence. Could humans master the new rhythms of the earth without repeating the mistakes of the past? Could permanence be sustained without collapsing into fragility? The answers lay not only in fields and herds, but in imagination, in the ability to envision futures beyond immediate survival. Ahead, the first true villages were becoming towns, the first rituals were becoming traditions, and the first experiments in cultivation were blooming into agriculture. Humanity was not merely surviving anymore, it was beginning to shape destiny, though whether destiny would be triumph or tragedy remained uncertain, hidden in the soil, the stars, and the fragile bonds of community. The transition from the last Ice Age into the warming Holocene epoch marked more than a climatic shift. It was the turning of a page in humanity's story. The ice had taught endurance, but the new world demanded imagination of another kind. As valleys blossomed and rivers swelled, humans found themselves at a crossroads between old ways and emerging possibilities. The nomadic rhythm of pursuit and migration, honed over tens of thousands of years, gave way to a growing impulse to stay, to build, to shape. The great experiment of permanence was taking root. One of the most striking developments of this time was the rise of monumental architecture. In places like Göbekli Tepe, on a hilltop in southeastern Anatolia, hunter-gatherers carved massive stone pillars, arranging them into circular enclosures that may have served as ritual centres. These structures, built around 11,000 years ago, predate agriculture in the region, suggesting that spiritual or communal gatherings may have catalysed the move towards settled life. The stones are carved with animals, foxes, snakes, wild boars, reminders of the Ice Age world, now transmuted into symbols. To erect such monuments required cooperation, planning, and a surplus of resources, hinting that communities were no longer bound solely to immediate survival. Ritual itself had become a force powerful enough to organise society. In fertile valleys, the domestication of plants began to accelerate. Wild grasses such as einkorn and emmer wheat, once gathered from fields, were deliberately planted. Over generations, humans unknowingly selected for traits that made these plants more useful. Seeds that clung less tightly to stalks, kernels that grew larger, yields that became more reliable. This gradual domestication was not a single invention, but the slow weaving of human intention into nature's cycles. To cultivate was to gamble against uncertainty, to trade the flexibility of foraging for the predictability and risk of harvest. Animals, too, were drawn deeper into this experiment. Sheep and goats, once hunted across hills, became managed herds. The earliest evidence of corrals and enclosures suggests that humans were learning to control breeding, keeping young animals alive for longer, tapping into milk and wool as renewable resources. Cattle and pigs followed, their domestication reshaping diets, economies, and even social hierarchies. To tether survival to animals was to tie fate to creatures that could multiply, sicken, or perish under environmental stress. But it was also to create a new rhythm of life, one built on cycles of breeding, milking, shearing, and butchering. This new way of life reshaped communities. Villages grew where fertile soils and reliable water encouraged settlement. Houses of mud brick and stone clustered together, forming networks of pathways, courtyards, and communal spaces. In places like Jericho, walls rose around settlements, suggesting both defence and the symbolic marking of territory. These walls, like the monumental pillars of ritual sites, were not only practical, but emblematic, declarations that humans were claiming permanence against a backdrop of a still restless earth. The shift towards sedentary life did not come without cost. Bones from early agriculturalists reveal nutritional deficiencies, shorter stature, signs of anemia, and tooth decay, evidence that diets narrowed compared to the variety of hunter-gatherers. Reliance on a few staple crops made communities vulnerable to famine if harvests failed. Living in close quarters with animals introduced new diseases, zoonoses, that spread quickly among dense populations. The very innovations that promised security also invited new vulnerabilities. Yet despite these hardships, the cultural flowering of this period was undeniable. Pottery emerged as both a functional and artistic innovation. Clay vessels, hardened in fire, allowed for the storage of grain and liquids, transforming how food was preserved and consumed. Decorated with patterns of lines, spirals, and animals, these vessels reveal an aesthetic impulse that endured even amid toil. Pottery was more than utility. It was identity, marking communities with distinctive styles and linking daily life to expressions of beauty. Ritual practices deepened in complexity. Burials became more elaborate, with grave goods indicating status, profession, or lineage. Figurines of animals and humans proliferated, often stylized or symbolic. Some depict women with exaggerated features, echoing earlier Venus figurines but now perhaps tied to fertility cults associated with agriculture. Others represent animals central to community survival, suggesting reverence or the invocation of protection. Ritual, once performed in caves hidden from the world, now spilled into open landscapes, anchored in the daily life of villages. Trade expanded with the growth of settlements. Obsidian from volcanic regions travelled hundreds of miles, fashioned into sharp blades prized for their utility. Shells, stones, and pigments crossed mountain ranges, evidence of networks that tied distant groups together. These exchanges were not simply practical but cultural, carrying ideas, symbols, and techniques that knit early agricultural societies into a shared fabric. The bonds of trade reinforced resilience, ensuring that innovations spread beyond isolated valleys. Even as communities grew, memory of the Ice Age lingered. The myths told around fires spoke of giants who once roamed the plains, of floods that swallowed lands, of gods of ice and fire who shaped the world. These stories preserved ecological memory, reminding new generations of a time when survival depended on mobility and adaptability. In the myths of floods and vanished lands, echoes that would later appear in Mesopotamian epics and biblical tales, lay the voices of ancestors who had watched seas rise and plains drown. The stars, once guides for hunters across tundra, now became calendars for farmers. The heliacal rising of stars marked planting and harvesting. The solstices guided rituals tied to the sun's strength. Astronomy and agriculture intertwined, giving rise to cosmologies that link survival to the heavens. To plant was to trust not only the soil but the sky, to embed human labour within a larger order of cycles and constellations. And yet the earth continued to remind humanity that control was an illusion. Sudden droughts struck fertile valleys, rivers changed course, and storms levelled fields. Some settlements collapsed, their people scattering, their walls left to crumble beneath shifting sands. For every Jericho or Çatalhöyük that flourished, others faded into obscurity, victims of the earth's caprice. Survival in this new age demanded not only cultivation but adaptation to failure, a lesson as old as the glaciers, now written into the fields of grain. The paradox of this age was clear. Abundance made life more complex, not simpler. It created surpluses that allowed art, ritual, and architecture to flourish, but it also birthed inequality, conflict, and new vulnerabilities. The Ice Age had forged resilience through scarcity. The Holocene was forging resilience through excess. In both cases, survival depended not merely on tools or food, but on imagination, the capacity to reimagine life when old strategies faltered. As forests spread, as villages rose, as myths deepened, humanity's destiny was shifting. The lessons of the Ice Age, mobility, adaptability, cooperation, were not abandoned but transformed, woven into new patterns of permanence. The question now was whether permanence could endure the Earth's unpredictability, or whether the same forces that had buried mammoths and drowned plains would one day sweep away villages and monuments alike. On the horizon, unseen by those who planted the first fields or carved the first pillars, lay the dawn of civilizations, of cities, writing, kingdoms and empires. But the roots of that future were here, in the fragile villages of the post-Ice Age world, where humanity first dared to shape destiny from soil, stone and memory. The world that emerged after the last Ice Age was both fertile and fragile, a place where abundance encouraged settlement, but uncertainty never fully receded. Even as humans planted seeds and tended animals, the earth reminded them that stability was an illusion. Storms still swept coasts, rivers still changed course, and the faint memory of glaciers lingered in mountains crowned with ice. To live in this new epoch was to balance hope with vigilance, invention with humility. Villages grew larger, clustering along fertile valleys and rivers that offered both water and transport. The people of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, for instance, built houses packed tightly together, entered through rooftops rather than doors, as if the community itself was a single organism. Life here evolved around shared walls, shared spaces, and shared dangers. Inside, murals of hunters, animals, and geometric patterns adorned the walls, suggesting that even as life became more domestic, the imagination remained vast. Burials beneath floors, sometimes accompanied by figurines or beads, tied families to their homes in a profound cycle of continuity. Other communities rose along coasts, where fishing and trade shaped daily life. The ocean became not a barrier but a highway, carrying shells, obsidian, and ideas across vast distances. Seafaring began in earnest during this time, with humans venturing farther along coasts and eventually across open waters. To sail into uncertainty required trust not only in boats of reeds or wood, but in the stars themselves, now guides not just for seasons, but for journeys across horizons. The spirit of migration, once tied to herds and seasons, was reborn in the courage to navigate seas. Technology advanced alongside settlement. Pottery, once a novelty, became indispensable. Its shapes evolved from simple bowls to jars with wide mouths and intricate designs, some used for storage, others for rituals. Kilns allowed for higher temperatures and more durable vessels. Polished stone tools appeared, axes capable of clearing forest for fields, sickles designed to reap harvests of grain. These innovations represented a new kind of relationship with the land, not passive gathering, but active transformation. Humanity was no longer merely adapting to ecosystems, but reshaping them. This reshaping extended to animals. Sheep and goats, once roaming wild, became integral to village life, their wool and milk forming part of daily sustenance. Cattle, powerful yet manageable, were yoked to fields, their strength harnessed for agriculture. Pigs rooted near settlements, feeding on scraps and multiplying rapidly. These relationships marked a profound departure from the Ice Age bond with prey. Animals were no longer only hunted, they were bred, tended, and absorbed into human identity. In carvings and figurines they appeared not just as food, but as symbols, spirits woven into the cycles of fertility and survival. The new permanence altered social life as well. Larger populations demanded new systems of organization. Leaders emerged, not always through force but through the ability to coordinate labor, settle disputes, and maintain relationships with neighboring groups. Shamans and ritual specialists wielded influence, their roles expanding as spiritual life intertwined with agriculture. Fertility rituals, invoking the cycles of seed and harvest, began to replace the hunt-centered rites of the Ice Age. Temples, shrines, and communal enclosures rose from stone, embodying the collective effort of entire villages. But with permanence came vulnerability. Droughts could devastate crops, leaving once thriving villages on the brink of collapse. Diseases spread more easily among denser populations, carving scars into communities that had never faced such epidemics. Conflicts arose over territory, water, and herds, as neighbouring groups clashed in ways rarely seen among small nomadic bands. Violence, now amplified by larger populations, left its mark in skeletal remains bearing wounds from arrows, axes, and clubs. The fragility of settled life revealed itself in these moments, proving that abundance could fracture as quickly as scarcity. Still, humanity adapted. Trade networks expanded further, carrying obsidian, jade, and other precious stones across continents. With trade came not only goods, but ideas, new farming techniques, new rituals, new forms of art. Symbols spread, binding communities into wider cultural spheres. A pattern carved in one valley appeared hundreds of miles away, as if imagination itself was travelling along with stone and shell. Exchange created resilience, ensuring that no village was entirely isolated, that knowledge of how to endure flowed as surely as rivers. The memory of the Ice Age lingered in myths. Oral traditions spoke of floods that had drowned entire lands, of giants who once roamed, of gods who commanded ice and fire. These stories were not fanciful tales, but encoded memories of real catastrophes, preserved as warnings. They shaped ritual life, reminding people that abundance could vanish, that the earth's gifts were not permanent but conditional, To pour offerings into rivers or to bury figurines in fields was not superstition, but dialogue with forces beyond control, acts of respect born from millennia of hardship. Art and music flourished in ways both intimate and monumental. Bone flutes gave way to drums, rattles, and stringed instruments, filling nights with rhythm and song. Pottery bore painted motifs of spirals, suns, and animals, transforming functional vessels into canvases of meaning. Figurines of women, men, and animals suggest mythologies in which fertility, death, and renewal were bound together. These acts of creation reflected not luxury but necessity. For art and ritual offered continuity in a world where rivers could flood and harvests could fail. The stars remained the ultimate anchor. Monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes reveal that humans were inscribing the cosmos into their lives with greater precision. Stone circles mark the turning of seasons, linking the agricultural cycle to the eternal rhythms of the sky. The heavens, constant above shifting fields and forests, offered reassurance. To track stars was to impose order on chaos, to weave survival into a cosmic narrative that gave permanence to fragile existence. The paradox of this age was clear. Permanence created fragility, abundance created risk, but it also created possibility. Communities that endured droughts learned to diversify crops. Those struck by disease developed resilience through survival and adaptation. Those forced to migrate carried seeds, animals, and stories into new lands, spreading the experiment of permanence ever farther. Each trial was a test, each collapse a lesson, each recovery a step towards civilizations not yet born. And so, the human journey carried forward, shaped by memory of the Ice Age but no longer defined by it. The world was warmer now, greener, more bountiful, but no less demanding. The lessons of mobility, cooperation and imagination remained essential, even as villages, temples and trade networks redefined what it meant to endure. Humanity was not simply surviving anymore. It was creating a future, one choice at a time, each choice carving paths toward destinies greater than survival. Yet the question remained, unspoken but persistent. Could these fragile villages, bound to the soil and the cycles of harvest, withstand the same forces that had once nearly erased humanity in the Age of Ice? The rivers still shifted, the seas still rose, the earth still trembled with change, and beyond those fragile walls of mud, brick and stone, history was waiting. A history of kingdoms, empires and civilizations that would rise from these humble beginnings. But for now, survival still hinged on the oldest truth of all. The earth gives, and the earth takes away. The post-Ice Age world was alive with contrasts. On one hand, rivers flooded with fertility, forests blossomed with fruit, and fields nurtured the first planted seeds. On the other, the earth remained restless, capable of undoing years of labour in a single season. Humanity had begun to settle, to tether its survival to the soil and to animals, yet the echoes of instability were never far away. In this balance between abundance and fragility, the foundations of future civilizations were quietly being laid. Villages multiplied across fertile valleys, their clusters of homes marking the landscape with permanence. In the Levant, mud-brick houses with plastered floors stood side by side, rebuilt layer upon layer until entire mounds, tells, rose from the earth. In central Anatolia, at Çatalhöyük, murals of leaping deer, vultures, and geometric designs adorned walls, turning dwellings into sacred spaces. These were not just shelters, they were repositories of identity, woven with memory, ritual, and continuity. Each household carried not only daily survival, but a link to ancestors buried beneath floors, tying the living directly to the soil of their homes. Agriculture deepened its hold. Wheat, barley, and lentils were cultivated with greater intensity, their cycles of planting and harvest shaping the rhythm of existence. grinding stones worn smooth by centuries of use reveal the labour that transformed kernels into flour, bread, and porridge. Domesticated goats and sheep graze nearby, their milk and wool supplementing diets and expanding resources. The management of herds and fields demanded cooperation, but also created new tensions. Who controlled land? Who stored the surplus? These questions were seeds of hierarchy, as power slowly began to root itself in control over resources. Trade flourished alongside farming. Obsidian from volcanic peaks travelled along routes stretching hundreds of miles, prized for its sharp edges and glossy beauty. Seashells from distant coasts appeared in inland graves, while beads of turquoise and carnelian linked mountain dwellers with plains people. These networks carried not only goods but ideas, new ways to build, new methods of cultivation, new symbols of belief. With every exchange, the web of humanity tightened, creating bonds across landscapes that had once been isolated. But abundance was never absolute. Climate fluctuations struck with cruelty. Periods of drought turned fertile valleys into dust, forcing communities to abandon fields or risk starvation. Archaeological evidence shows layers of settlement abruptly ending, tools left scattered as if people fled in haste. Disease, too, haunted these growing populations. The close proximity of humans and animals invited new pathogens, leaving skeletal remains scarred by infection and malnutrition. In some places, mortality was high, reminding people that no matter how advanced their tools or organised their villages, they were still vulnerable to forces unseen. Ritual life expanded in response to this fragility. Temples and communal enclosures rose, some built with stone carved into pillars and aligned with the movements of the heavens. These structures demanded enormous effort, far beyond the needs of survival, suggesting that belief itself had become central to human identity. To gather and build in honour of gods or ancestors was to assert meaning against uncertainty. Sacrifices of animals, offerings of grain, and figurines buried in fields were all ways of negotiating with powers beyond control. Religion was becoming a binding force, anchoring communities to narratives larger than themselves. Art, too, blossomed in this age of transition. Pottery vessels bore painted spirals, waves, and symbols that may have marked ownership, lineage, or myth. Figurines carved from stone and bone portrayed humans, animals, and hybrid forms, suggesting cosmologies where boundaries between the natural and spiritual blurred. These artifacts reveal a worldview where survival was not merely practical but symbolic, where tending a field or herding goats was inseparable from invoking protection, fertility, and balance. The stars played an increasingly prominent role in this symbolic order. Communities aligned monuments with solstices and equinoxes, weaving agriculture into cosmic cycles. The movement of the sun across the horizon marked planting and harvest. The waxing and waning of the moon guided ritual, and constellations became calendars written in the night sky. To gaze upward was to find order amid uncertainty, to anchor fragile lives in the permanence of the cosmos. Yet beneath this flowering of culture, deeper transformations were underway. The shift to farming and herding altered not only diets, but bodies. Bones from early agriculturalists show signs of stress, shorter stature, worn teeth, evidence of labour-intensive lives. The varied diet of hunter-gatherers, rich in game, fish, nuts and fruits, narrowed into cereals and dairy. Famine, once a threat of seasonal scarcity, became the spectre of harvest failure. To settle was to trade mobility for security, but it was also to trade diversity for dependence. Dependence created new social realities. With stored grain and domesticated animals, wealth could be accumulated. Some graves reveal individuals buried with ornaments, beads, and finely crafted tools, while others lie with little or nothing. Hierarchy, once muted in small bands, grew sharper in villages, marking the first steps towards structured inequality. Leadership, once fluid and situational, became tied to control of food, ritual, or trade. Power, like agriculture, was rooting itself in permanence. Conflict reflected these new tensions. Fortifications of timber and stone appear around some settlements, evidence that raids and warfare had begun to shadow community life. Disputes over land and water likely intensified as populations grew. Weapons found in graves, axes, daggers, and arrowheads, hint that violence was becoming an enduring part of human existence, no longer just the occasional clash of hunters, but organised strife between groups anchored to the land. Still, resilience endured. Communities adapted to failure, diversifying crops, managing herds more carefully, and strengthening trade to buffer against scarcity. They buried their dead with care, preserving memory as continuity. They painted, carved, and built not only to survive, but to leave echoes for future generations. Even in fragility, there was a determination to assert permanence, to tether human identity to earth and sky alike. The earth, however, never ceased its reminders. Seas continued to rise, swallowing coastlines and transforming familiar lands into memory. Flood myths, echoing across cultures from Mesopotamia to the Americas, may reflect the trauma of these drownings, preserved in story as warnings. Volcanoes erupted, covering valleys in ash. Earthquakes shattered stone walls. Each catastrophe reinforced the lesson first learned in the Ice Age, that stability was fleeting, and survival belonged to those who adapted not once but continually. The paradox of this age was stark. Humanity had stepped into abundance, yet abundance demanded as much resilience as scarcity. Agriculture, settlement, and ritual created the framework of civilization, but also introduced new fragilities: famine, disease, hierarchy, and war. The memory of wandering bands chasing mammoths still lingered, but the future was now rooted in villages, fields, and shrines. What was gained in permanence was balanced by the risk of collapse. And yet in this fragile equilibrium, the seeds of destiny were being sown. The earliest towns rose from clustered homes, the earliest temples from collective labour, the earliest myths from memories of ice and flood. Humanity was no longer merely surviving nature's changes, it was beginning to reshape the earth itself. But reshaping carried consequences. Forests cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation, animals bred into dependence. Each act bound humans more tightly to cycles of labour and responsibility. No longer was it possible to walk away from a failing valley without loss. Roots tied communities to place for better or worse. This entanglement would define the next chapters of human history. Ahead lay the rise of civilizations, with all their triumphs and tragedies. The echoes of the Ice Age still whispered, warning of fragility, but the path was set. The question was no longer whether humans could survive the Earth's upheavals, but whether they could survive their own inventions, their own reshaping of the world into something both powerful and perilous. The Ice Age had ended, yet its lessons never faded. Humanity now stood in a transformed world, one where rivers meandered through fertile plains, forests cloaked the once barren steppes, and villages dotted landscapes that had been sculpted by ice. The tools of survival had changed. Spears and flint blades were joined by sickles, grinding stones, and clay jars. The nomadic rhythm of migration was giving way to the rooted cycles of agriculture. But within this newfound permanence lay both promise and peril, for the earth remained restless, and humanity's own ingenuity was beginning to reshape destiny in ways no one could foresee. Villages continued to grow, clustering around fertile soils and dependable water. In Mesopotamia, people gathered along the Tigris and Euphrates, experimenting with irrigation to guide rivers into channels and fields. In Anatolia and the Levant, settlements like Jericho rose, their walls encircling homes and granaries that held the first stored surpluses of grain. These walls were not merely defensive structures, they were statements of permanence, declarations that humanity intended to hold the land against hunger, predators, and even time itself. For the first time, human communities began to look less like camps and more like small worlds unto themselves. Surplus changed everything. Where once food had been consumed as soon as it was gathered, now it could be stored, protected, and distributed. This created new dynamics of power. Those who managed granaries wielded influence, for they controlled the thread between feast and famine. Archaeological evidence of differential wealth in graves, some filled with beads, ornaments, or finely crafted tools, others almost bare, reveals that inequality was emerging, seeded by the control of food and land. Leadership, once fluid and situational in nomadic bands, began to crystallize into more enduring forms, but with surplus came risk. Stored grain attracted not only envy from neighbouring groups, but pests, rot, and dependency. A single bad harvest could turn abundance into catastrophe. Communities learned to diversify, planting multiple crops, raising herds of sheep, goats, and cattle, and strengthening trade networks to buffer against local shortages. Trade became the lifeblood of resilience, weaving together obsidian from Anatolia, shells from coasts, salt from deserts, and timber from mountains. The movement of goods carried with it the movement of ideas, ensuring that knowledge travelled as swiftly as stone and grain. Ritual and belief deepened alongside these changes. Temples rose in prominence, often at the heart of settlements, drawing people into communal ceremonies that tied fertility and harvest to divine powers. Figurines of animals and humans, some buried in fields, others placed in shrines, suggest a worldview in which survival was inseparable from the favour of unseen forces. The cycles of planting and reaping were imbued with sacred meaning, transforming agriculture from labour into liturgy. To sow seeds was to participate in cosmic renewal, to harvest was to partake in divine generosity. The stars, once guides for migrating hunters, became anchors for farming communities. Solstices and equinoxes marked the rhythm of planting and harvest. Early observatories, where the stone circles aligned with the sun, or post-marking lunar cycles, reveal the growing sophistication of human timekeeping. To watch the sky was to read the future, to align labour with the heavens, to seek reassurance in the permanence of the cosmos when the earth below was fragile. Astronomy and agriculture became intertwined, foreshadowing the great calendars and temples of civilizations yet to come. Art flourished in new forms. Pottery bore not only functional designs but intricate patterns of spirals, waves, and symbols that may have carried spiritual or social meaning. Walls of houses at Çatalhöyük displayed murals of hunting, animals, and even volcanic eruptions. Memory turned into image, community turned into canvas. Music, too, left its traces in bone flutes, drums, and rattles, instruments that filled nights with rhythm and ritual. These expressions of creativity were not luxuries. They were acts of resilience, of binding people together in identity, meaning, and hope. Yet the Earth's unpredictability never receded. Rising seas continued to swallow coasts, drowning lands like Doggerland in northern Europe, where once rivers and meadows sustained thriving communities. Flood myths, later recorded in Mesopotamian epics and biblical tales, may trace their origins to these drownings, memories preserved in story as warnings across generations. Drought struck fertile valleys, forcing migrations, while sudden storms destroyed crops and settlements. Volcanoes erupted, covering fields in ash, but also enriching soil in the long term. The earth gave and took away, reminding humanity that permanence was never guaranteed. Disease emerged as another invisible adversary. The close quarters of villages, combined with reliance on domesticated animals, created fertile ground for pathogens. Skeletal remains reveal arthritis, tuberculosis, and malnutrition, signs of the toll taken by sedentary life. The varied diet of hunter-gatherers had given way to dependence on cereals, leaving some communities weaker even as they grew larger. Yet resilience lay not only in health, but in adaptation. Over generations, humans developed immunities, strategies of care, and cultural practices that helped them endure new illnesses. Social life grew more layered. With larger populations came division of labour. Farmers, herders, potters, toolmakers, ritual leaders. Women played vital roles in cultivation, food processing and craft work, while men often focused on herding, hunting or defence. Children too became part of the labour force, learning skills from elders in cycles of apprenticeship. Life was no longer just survival, it was structured, patterned, and marked by roles that bound individuals into the larger fabric of community. But these bonds could fray. Conflict between groups grew sharper as competition for land, water and trade intensified. Weapons crafted with greater precision, polished stone axes, finely chipped arrowheads, and daggers hint at violence not just in hunting but in warfare. Some settlements built ditches or palisades, fortifying themselves against raids. Others collapsed entirely, abandoned after destruction by neighbouring groups or by natural disaster. The fragility of permanence was clear. To stay in one place was to invite both prosperity and peril. And yet, through all this turbulence, humanity carried forward its most powerful inheritance, imagination. The memory of the Ice Age still whispered in myths, in carvings of vanished animals, in stories of floods and giants. These memories served as warnings, but also as frameworks for meaning. They reminded people that change was inevitable, that survival required not only tools but vision. To build a wall, to plant a field, to carve a figurine, all were acts of faith that tomorrow could be secured, even if the earth shifted again. The paradox of this age was stark. The Ice Age had demanded resilience through scarcity. The Holocene demanded resilience through abundance. Villages, temples and trade networks promised continuity, yet they also created fragilities. Famine when harvests failed, disease when populations grew, conflict when surpluses were envied. Humanity was learning not just to endure nature but to manage itself, to balance cooperation and conflict, ritual and labour, tradition and innovation. The stage was set for something larger than villages or fields. The threads of agriculture, animal domestication, trade and ritual were weaving together into the first tapestry of civilization. What began as survival after ice was becoming the dawn of cities, of writing, of kingdoms. The great experiment of permanence was about to accelerate, carrying humanity into an age of both triumph and tragedy, an age where the lessons of the Ice Age would be both remembered and in some places forgotten. And so, as the rivers swelled and temples rose, humanity found itself on the threshold of transformation. The memory of glaciers still haunted the land, but the future now belonged to seeds planted in soil, to walls raised in stone, to stories written not just in myth, but soon in symbols carved into clay. The question was no longer whether humans could survive nature's wrath, but whether they could survive the civilizations they were about to create. The last breath of the Ice Age had long since faded, yet its shadow remained etched into the bones, the myths, and the landscapes of humanity. By the time the great glaciers had retreated to the poles, humans had already reshaped themselves in response to millennia of hunger, storms, and extinction. They carried forward scars from an age of scarcity, but also strengths born of endurance, the ability to imagine beyond crisis, to weave community from fragility, to transform uncertainty into adaptation. These were the legacies of survival that now set the stage for civilization itself. In fertile valleys, the seeds of permanence sprouted into something larger. The villages that had begun as clusters of mud brick houses and granaries grew into proto-cities, their walls enclosing not just homes but shrines, storage facilities and public spaces. Jericho, perched on the edge of the Jordan Valley, rose into one of the earliest true towns, its stone tower standing as both a sentinel and a symbol. Such monuments revealed a new impulse, to build for generations yet unborn, to imagine permanence in stone. No hunter-gatherer band could have conceived of such scale, for their world had been dictated by movement. But now, rooted to the soil, humans began to think in centuries. The growth of settlements intensified hierarchy. Surpluses of grain and livestock gave power to those who managed them. Priests, chiefs, or elders emerged as custodians of both the material and the sacred, intertwining the governance of food with the governance of belief. Ritual reinforced this power, offerings of grain at shrines, feasts organized by leaders, ceremonies that bound the prosperity of crops to the favor of the divine. In this union of agriculture and cosmology lay the seeds of organized religion and state power, entwined in ways that would shape millennia to come. But the blessings of agriculture came with costs that no one in the depth of the Ice Age could have imagined. Diets narrowed, leading to malnutrition even amid abundance. Skeletons reveal shorter stature, crooked spines and worn teeth, signs of harder labour and nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherer ancestors. Diseases spread swiftly through denser populations, as pathogens leapt between humans and domesticated animals. The very act of permanence, of living together in larger numbers, of storing food, of taming animals, created vulnerabilities that scarcity had never known. Still, culture blossomed as never before. Pottery bore intricate motifs, sometimes purely decorative, sometimes carrying symbols that hinted at shared myths or clan identities. Jewellery fashioned from shells and precious stones became markers of status and belonging. Music grew richer, with drums and flutes filling nights with rhythm, turning gatherings into communal rituals of sound. And art extended into the very architecture of daily life. Plastered walls painted with animals, fertility symbols, or abstract designs. For the first time, the human world itself was becoming a canvas, a place where survival was wrapped in beauty and belief. The memory of the Ice Age lingered in stories and rituals, myths of floods, of vanished lands, of monstrous animals that once roamed the earth, carried forward echoes of real events: the drowning of Doggerland, the retreat of mammoths, the great deluges unleashed by melting glaciers. These myths were not idle fictions, but cultural memory, a way of preserving knowledge of catastrophe. They served as both warnings and explanations, grounding the uncertainties of the present in the wisdom of the past. The stars remained a constant companion in this age of transformation. Observatories of stone mark solstices and equinoxes, embedding celestial order into the cycles of agriculture. The sky became a vast calendar, a map of destiny, a reminder that beyond the floods and famines there was order written in the cosmos. By aligning human life with the heavens, communities sought to anchor themselves in something eternal, even as rivers shifted and storms raged. Conflict also grew in scale. Where hunter-gatherer skirmishes had been fleeting, now villages and towns clashed over land, water and trade. Weapons became more refined. Polished axes, flint daggers, and later copper blades, each a tool of survival, but also of dominance. Fortifications rose around settlements, evidence of fear and rivalry. Warfare, once an occasional act of desperation, was becoming a structural part of life. The fragility of abundance was revealed in these clashes, where surplus was both prize and provocation. Yet alongside conflict came cooperation. Trade routes stretched farther, carrying obsidian, salt, shells, and new crops across vast distances. These exchanges wove humanity into a wider web, ensuring that no single community remained entirely isolated. Ideas travelled as swiftly as goods, spreading agricultural techniques, artistic styles, and spiritual concepts across continents. In this exchange lay the resilience of the species, for knowledge became the most enduring resource of all. The transformation of landscapes continued apace. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers diverted for irrigation, Animals bred into new forms. Humanity, once shaped by nature, was now reshaping nature in return. This was both triumph and danger. Fields enriched life but tethered people to cycles of toil. Irrigation expanded abundance but risked salinizing soil. Domesticated animals provided meat, milk, and labor, but also demanded constant care. Humanity had stepped into a partnership with the earth that was both creative and precarious, binding its fate more tightly than ever to the health of ecosystems. Amid this transformation, the human imagination soared. Communities envisioned gods who governed fertility, rain, and harvest. Deities who mirrored both the hope and the anxiety of agricultural life. Temples rose as centers of both worship and governance, their rituals reinforcing the bonds between people, nature, and the divine. The act of planting became sacred, the harvest a festival, the cycles of death and rebirth embedded in both fields and faith. The spiritual life of humanity was no longer just about enduring the wilderness, it was about shaping cosmic meaning from the soil itself. The great paradox of this era was clear. Humanity had survived the Ice Age by being small, mobile, and flexible, yet now it sought survival through being rooted, expansive, and permanent. The strategies that once saved it, movement, adaptation, diversity, were giving way to new strategies of control, stability, and accumulation. But control was an illusion, as floods, droughts, and disease repeatedly reminded. The question that haunted every community was whether permanence could truly endure, or whether humanity was building fragility into its very foundations. And so the story of survival stretched onward. The Ice Age had ended, but its lessons lived on in every ritual offering, every myth of vanished giants, every wall raised against floods and invaders. Humanity carried forward not only scars of hardship, but the memory of resilience, the knowledge that endurance was possible even against overwhelming odds. The future lay in villages that would become towns, in shrines that would become temples, in fields that would give rise to cities. Out of ice and scarcity, out of storms and hunger, humanity had carved the capacity to imagine and to build. The species that had nearly vanished beneath glaciers was now poised to shape the earth itself, but in shaping, it would also risk. Civilizations would rise and fall, empires would flourish and collapse, and the same fragility that had haunted small bands of Ice Age hunters would haunt kingdoms and cities. The story of survival was not ending, it was beginning again on a larger stage. The Ice Age was the crucible. What emerged from it was not just survival, but the essence of what it means to be human. Resilient, imaginative, fragile, and unyielding. And as the rivers of time carried humanity forward, the memory of ice remained, a whisper in myths, a warning in floods, a reminder that every triumph rests upon the edge of uncertainty.